What if the peace you're searching for is already here waiting in this very moment? In a world full of distractions, Zen invites us to pause and simply be. These rare Zen stories and timeless Buddhist teachings are not just tales, they are quiet doors back to presence. Over the next 3 hours, you'll hear gentle truths that help you feel calm, think clearly, and open your heart to now. Let each story bring you back to stillness, back to balance, back to the present. Let's get started. The sound of one thread unraveling. In a quiet monastery high in the mountains, a young monk sat alone by the weaving room, watching an old master spin silk thread. Day after day, the master worked in silence, gently guiding the thread from spool to cloth, never seeming rushed, never distracted. The young monk, new to temple life, was struggling. His mind was noisy. He was full of questions, full of doubt. He wanted to reach enlightenment quickly. He wanted answers now, but all he found was silence and the slow, patient weaving of cloth. One day, the monk could not take it any longer. He walked up to the old master and asked, "Why must everything here be so slow? Why do we repeat the same routines? Why do I feel like nothing is changing, no matter how hard I try?" The old master did not speak. He continued weaving. Then, very gently, one of the threads in his hand broke and unraveled from the cloth, falling silently to the floor. The master finally looked up and asked, "Did you hear it?" The monk blinked. "Hear what?" "The sound of one thread unraveling," the master said. The monk was puzzled. There was no sound. The master nodded. "Exactly. When something unravels slowly, quietly, without force, it becomes part of the moment. It does not scream. It does not panic. It simply lets go. You are trying to force your path, and in doing so, you cannot hear what is already unraveling within you." The young monk sat in silence, realizing that all his effort to become awakened was drowning out the small shifts already happening inside him. Like the thread, his old thoughts, his impatience, his need for control were slowly loosening, but because he was listening for something loud, he missed the quiet truth unfolding. Moral of the story: not all change makes noise. Growth often begins in silence, in the moments when we stop chasing answers and start listening deeply. Like a single thread letting go from cloth, transformation can be gentle and still. When we learn to hear what is quiet, we reconnect with the present and begin to see what was always there. The next story is called Hakuin's Inkstone and the Sudden Rain. Hakuin was a brilliant Zen master, known for his sharp wit and deep insight. Though admired by many, he often lived simply, tucked away in a small village at the edge of the forest. Among his few possessions was a treasured inkstone, smooth and black, gifted to him by a teacher many years before. It was said that Hakuin used this inkstone to write the most powerful teachings, short, piercing words that could awaken the heart like thunder in the sky. One summer afternoon, Hakuin sat beneath the eaves of his hut, brush in hand, inkstone before him. The sky was clear, and the breeze was soft. He was about to write a verse when, without warning, dark clouds rolled in. A sudden downpour burst from the sky. Rain struck the roof, wind slammed the shutters, and the world turned gray in seconds. In the rush, a gust of wind knocked the inkstone off the table. It hit the ground, cracking into 2 pieces. The young monk watching from nearby gasped, "Master, your inkstone, it's ruined." But Hakuin didn't flinch. He looked at the broken stone, then at the sky, and simply said, "Ah, sudden rain." He walked out into the storm and stood still, letting the rain soak through his robes, his hair, his skin. His eyes were calm, not sad, not angry, just awake. The monk, confused, ran after him. "But master, that stone was your treasure. How can you be so calm?" Hakuin looked at him and replied, The rain did not ask for permission. The wind gave no warning. The inkstone did not cry when it broke. So why should I? The monk stood in silence, slowly understanding. The lesson was not in the stone or the rain, but in the response. Nothing in life is guaranteed to stay, not even what we love. To grasp tightly invites suffering, but to accept the moment, even when it shatters something dear, is the path to peace. Moral of the story: life brings sudden storms. What we cherish may be lost in an instant, but peace is not found in what we hold on to, it's found in how we let go. When we stop resisting what is, even a broken inkstone can become a doorway to freedom. The next story is called The Tea That Spoke in Silence. In a small Zen temple nestled deep in the hills of Kyoto, there lived an elderly nun named Yuki. She was known not for giving sermons, but for her tea. Every morning and afternoon, she would prepare tea for whoever came, monks, villagers, travelers. No words were needed. She would serve with bowed head, gentle hands, and a quiet heart. One day, a young scholar visited the temple. He was full of questions about Zen, about enlightenment, about the nature of mind and truth. He had studied the sutras, debated teachers, and memorized verses. Still, peace escaped him. He came to Yuki, hoping for an answer, some hidden key that would unlock his restless mind. When he arrived, she did not speak. She simply bowed and began to prepare tea. The scholar waited politely at first, expecting her to speak when ready, but she said nothing. Minutes passed. The tea steamed. The room was silent but alive with the soft clink of the teacups, the warmth of the kettle, the scent of roasted leaves. Unable to hold it in any longer, the scholar blurted, "Revered nun, I came seeking wisdom. Will you not share even one word with me?" Yuki looked up, smiled kindly, and poured his tea. She placed the cup in front of him and said gently, "Listen." The scholar, confused, said, "Listen to what?" She did not reply. She simply sat across from him and drank her tea in silence. So he sipped, and as he did, something shifted. He began to notice the heat of the cup in his hands, the soft earthiness of the tea, the way the rising steam disappeared into air. He noticed her breathing, his own heartbeat, the wind outside, the space between sounds. And in that silence, without any words, his mind finally stilled. He looked at Yuki, eyes wide with something new, not knowledge, but presence. She nodded. The tea has spoken. Moral of the story: wisdom doesn't always come through words. Sometimes, the deepest truths arise in silence, in the quiet of a moment fully lived. When we stop seeking noise and answers, we begin to hear the present. And in the present, even a simple cup of tea can speak the whole truth. The next story is called Zhaozhou's Empty Teacup. Zhaozhou, one of the most revered Zen masters in history, was known for his simplicity. He rarely gave long talks or complicated teachings. Instead, his lessons were hidden in plain moments, easy to miss, yet unforgettable once seen. One afternoon, a wandering monk came to visit. The monk had traveled far and studied many teachings. He bowed deeply to Zhaozhou and said, "Master, I have come to learn the highest truth." Zhaozhou smiled kindly and gestured for him to sit. A small pot of tea was prepared, as was tradition. The old master poured the steaming tea into the monk's cup until it reached the brimbit. Then, to the monk's surprise, he kept pouring. The tea overflowed, spilling onto the table and onto the monk's robes. "Master," the monk cried out, "the cup is full, no more can go in." Zhaozhou set the pot down and said, "Exactly. You are like this cup, already full of your own ideas, questions, and knowledge. How can I teach you anything unless you first empty yourself?" The monk sat frozen, realizing he had come with his mind so full, there had been no room to receive. In his eagerness to learn, He had been holding tightly to everything he thought he knew. And in that tight grip, there was no space for stillness, no space for now. Zhaozhou didn't say another word. He simply drank his own tea, slowly, calmly, with full attention. That silence, paired with the warmth of the cup and the quiet moment, taught more than any sutra ever could. The monk looked at his own cup empty and smiled softly. He finally understood. Moral of the story: a full mind cannot receive. When we cling to our thoughts, our judgments, our constant need to know, we leave no space for truth to enter. Real wisdom begins when we become still, when we empty the cup. In that quiet openness, the present moment pours itself in, and with it, the simple taste of clarity. The next story is called The Monk Who Asked the Moon for Directions. Long ago, in a remote mountain temple, a young monk named Riku found himself lost, though not in the woods, but within himself. Despite years of meditation, chanting, and study, he felt no closer to peace. His thoughts ran wild. He often wandered at night, unable to sleep, questioning everything. One evening, under a full moon, Riku climbed a steep path to the temple's highest ridge. Below him, valleys stretched like sleeping waves. Above, the moon shone clear and silent. The world felt vast, and he felt small. In that stillness, he whispered aloud, not expecting an answer, "Where do I go now? What is the right path?" A voice behind him replied, "The moon does not give directions." Startled, Riku turned to see his old teacher, Master Enso, standing behind him, hands folded in his sleeves. Riku bowed deeply, ashamed. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted. "I study, I sit, I serve, but I feel lost. Every path seems empty." Master Enso nodded slowly and joined him, eyes resting on the moon. "You ask the moon to guide you," he said, "but the moon only reflects light. It points to nothing. It shows everything." Riku frowned. "Then how do I find the way?" Enso smiled gently. "You're looking for a map, but the path is not on the ground. It is in how you walk. Even the moon does not move, it simply shines. It does not ask where to go, it just is." They stood in silence, the wind brushing the grass, the moon steady above. Slowly, something softened inside the young monk. The need to chase, to find, to fix faded. He didn't need the moon to give him a path. He only needed to walk with awareness, to let each step be complete. As they turned to descend the mountain, Riku noticed his feet pressing into the earth, the sound of leaves in the wind, and the gentle glow lighting the trail. He was not lost. He had simply forgotten to look where he already stood. Moral of the story: sometimes we search outside for guidance, asking the world to give us direction. But true clarity doesn't come from signs, it comes from presence. The moon doesn't point the way, it reminds us to be where we are. When we walk with awareness, even the darkest path becomes clear. The next story is called 2 Leaves in a Stream at Dusk. At the edge of a forest where the hills met a slow-moving stream, 2 monks so young, one old, sat by the water as the sun began to fall behind the trees. The day had been long, filled with chores and meditation, and now, in the quiet light of dusk, they rested together without speaking. The younger monk had been struggling for weeks. His thoughts were heavy, and his heart pulled in many directions. He feared he was falling behind on the path, and often questioned whether he belonged in the monastery at all. As they sat in silence, the younger monk sighed and finally spoke. "Master, I feel like I'm drifting. I try to meditate, but my mind races. I try to serve, but I feel distracted. I want to be present, but I keep floating away." The old monk didn't respond right away. Instead, he pointed to the stream before them. There, carried gently by the current, were 2 yellow leaves. They floated side by side, turning slowly in the water's rhythm. One leaf spun for a moment, then calmed. The other drifted in a smooth, steady path. Neither leaf controlled where it was going. The stream guided them both. "Do you see?" the old monk said softly. "Each leaf is carried by the same water. One moves quietly, the other shifts and spins, yet both are going where the stream leads." The younger monk watched, eyes softening. "You are not lost," the old monk continued. "You are in the stream. Some days your mind will spin, some days you will float peacefully, but the current of practice carries you, even when you feel unsure. Just as the leaves do not resist the flow, we must learn to trust the path even when it feels uncertain." The leaves slowly disappeared around a bend. The sky deepened to twilight. The younger monk bowed his head, not in defeat, but in surrender. To the stream, to the moment, to the quiet truth that presence isn't about perfection, it's about trust. Moral of the story: you don't have to feel steady to be on the path. Like leaves in a stream, we may twist and turn, but the current still carries us. Let go of the need to control every thought. Trust the flow of now. The present holds you even when you feel lost. The next story is called "When the Sutra Burned Itself." In a quiet village temple, far from the cities and crowds, lived an elderly monk named Soren. For decades, he had cared for a hand-copied sutra, passed down from generations of teachers before him. The scroll was old ink faded, edges fragile, but it was considered sacred. Monks would bow before it daily, chanting its verses with reverence. Soren was known to protect it with deep devotion. He believed the words held the power to awaken any heart. He would say, "This sutra is the voice of the Buddha. Never let it be harmed." But over the years, Soren became more attached to the scroll than to its meaning. He watched over it more closely than his own breath. When new monks arrived, he warned them to never touch it with unclean hands, never let it feel the wind or sun. Then one bitter winter night, lightning struck the edge of the temple. The wooden beams caught fire. Flames swept quickly through the library where the sutra was kept. By the time monks awakened and rushed in with buckets of water, it was too late. The sacred scroll had already turned to ash. Soren fell to his knees. His body shook. The monk stood silently, unsure of what to say. But as the old monk knelt there, watching the smoke rise, something in him shifted. Tears welled in his eyes, but not from pain, from recognition. He whispered, "It's finally free." The others looked confused. "Master," one asked softly, "what do you mean?" Soren replied, voice trembling but calm, "I held the words tighter than the truth they pointed to. I guarded the form, but forgot the formless. The fire burned the paper, but not the Dharma. That was never in the ink." He closed his eyes and bowed not to the scroll, but to the space it once filled, the silence, the present moment. From that day forward, Soren stopped quoting the sutra in rituals. Instead, he taught with silence, stillness, and the way he moved through each day, gentle, awake, completely here. Moral of the story: we often cling to the form of wisdom, the words, the rituals, the symbol sand, forget what they truly point to. But truth is not found in paper or memory. Sometimes it takes a fire to show us that real wisdom cannot be burned. It lives in silence, in presence, and in the letting go. The next story is called "The Silent Answer to an Unspoken Question." In a remote Zen temple where mist clung to the stones and the mornings began with birdsong instead of bells, there was a master known for saying very little. His students respected him deeply, though they sometimes struggled with his silence. He never scolded, rarely explained, and offered no formal lectures. He simply lived, and in his way of walking, of eating, of folding his robes, he taught more than most could with words. One day, A troubled student arrived from a distant city. He had read many sutras, practiced long hours of meditation, and visited several teachers. But still, a quiet emptiness haunted him, something he couldn't explain, something no teaching had ever answered. He carried this question in his heart like a stone. What is missing? Though he had no words for it, it followed him wherever he went. He arrived at the temple and was welcomed in. For 3 days the master said nothing to him. He simply gestured, "Come, sit, eat, walk." The student followed, confused. The silence pressed in. There were no instructions, no teachings, no answers. Only the soft shuffle of sandals on stone, the crackle of firewood, the sound of wind moving through trees. On the 4th morning, they sat across from each other in the small tea room. The student's heart was full, not with anger, not with pride, but a quiet ache. He bowed deeply, and tears began to fall. The master did not ask why. He simply poured tea, handed him the cup, and looked into his eyes with deep kindness. Nothing was said. But in that silence, something shifted. The student felt the question dissolve, not answered, but no longer needed. The master's gaze had seen him fully, without judgment, without fixing, and in that stillness he saw himself. The silence had not ignored his question, it had embraced it. And in that embrace, he found peace. Moral of the story: not every question needs an answer. Some only need to be heard. In silence we meet what words cannot touch. When we stop trying to explain our pain or fix our thoughts, we discover a deeper truth. Presence itself is the response, and sometimes the greatest healing is being seen without needing to speak. The next story is called Mazu's Broken Bell and the Time That Froze. Master Mazu was known for his unpredictable ways. His students never quite knew when a lesson would appear, sometimes in a word, sometimes in a slap, sometimes in the space between both. He believed Zen could not be explained with logic alone. It had to be felt, lived, like lightning striking in clear sky. At the center of his monastery stood an old bronze bell. Every morning, its deep sound would echo through the valley, calling monks to rise, breathe, and begin the day in awareness. The bell was not just a tool, it was a rhythm, a reminder of presence, a keeper of time. One winter morning, thick fog covered the temple grounds. A young monk was chosen to ring the bell. He approached it carefully, bowing first, then lifting the wooden striker. But as he swung, something strange happened. The bell cracked with a dull, broken thud. The sound was wrong, empty. The great bell had split straight down the side, silent, still. The monk panicked and ran to find Mazu, who came at once. The others followed, expecting the master to mourn the loss. But Mazu didn't look disappointed. He stood before the bell, eyes quiet. Then he sat down, cross-legged in front of it. The monks gathered, confused. After a long silence, Mazu spoke. "The bell has done something we could note, it has silenced time." The monks looked around, not understanding. The air was still. No one moved. A single crow called in the distance, then nothing. It was as if the day itself had paused. Mazu continued, "You've relied on this bell to wake you, to mark your hours, to keep your minds moving forward. But now that it is broken, can you still hear the morning?" The young monk who struck the bell lowered his eyes. "I don't hear anything, master." "Then listen more deeply," Mazu said. "Listen to what the bell once pointed to, not the bell itself." In that moment, the fog seemed to thin. The monks began to hear things they had missed: the drip of melting snow, the crack of distant branches, the sound of their own breath. Nothing had changed except their attention. Moral of the story: we often rely on routines and sounds to guide us, but true awareness begins when those signals disappear. Sometimes the silence after something breaks holds more teaching than its sound ever did. When the bell no longer rings, we are asked to wake up on our own. And in that stillness, Time itself falls away. The next story is called Master Linji's Laughter at the Wall. Master Linji was not like other Zen teachers. Where others were quiet, he could be loud. Where others whispered, he sometimes shouted. His students never quite knew what to expect, but they followed him, because somewhere beneath his wildness was a truth they could feel in their bones. One evening, after a long day of sweeping leaves and chopping wood, a student approached Linji with frustration in his eyes. He had practiced for years sitting, chanting, studying, and still felt far from awakening. "Master," he said, "I do everything I'm told. I follow the precepts. I meditate every day, but I still feel like I'm staring at a wall. Nothing moves, nothing changes. Am I failing?" Linji didn't respond. He simply got up, walked across the room, and stood in front of the temple wall. For a long, long moment, he said nothing. Then suddenly he burst into laughter. It was loud and full, like thunder cracking through the stillness. The student blinked, unsure if he had been mocked or taught something beyond words. Linji turned to him, eyes shining. "You say you're staring at a wall? Good, then stare at it. Stare until the wall stares back. Stare until you forget there was ever a wall at all." The student remained silent, heart pounding. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he felt something break open inside a tension he had carried for too long. Something melted in the sound of that laughter. It wasn't cruel. It was free. "Stop waiting for the wall to move," Linji said softly now. "It's you who must stop clinging. You chase awakening like a dog chasing its tail. You think the path is somewhere ahead, but it's already under your feet." The student sat down, his breath shaky, eyes full. The wall was still there. But now it didn't feel like an obstacle. It felt like a mirror. Moral of the story: sometimes the barriers we see are built from our own expectations. We wait for signs, for answers, for movement, but all the while we are already where we need to be. Laughter can be a bell. Confusion can be a gate. When we stop forcing the moment to be different, the wall disappears and presence begins. The next story is called The Cloud That Didn't Pass. There was once a young monk named Tamo who lived in a temple perched high above the clouds. Every day the sky would shift and change, mist in the morning, sunlight in the afternoon, stars at night. Tamo loved to sit and watch the clouds move. It gave him peace. It reminded him that nothing stays forever. But one day he noticed something strange. A single dark cloud appeared and lingered above the temple. It didn't drift like the others. It didn't change shape. It stayed day after day, unmoving. The monks grew uneasy. They whispered that something felt wrong. The air was heavy. The light was dim. Tamo, who had once found comfort in the sky, now felt disturbed. He began to lose sleep, his thoughts tangled with worry. "Why won't it pass?" he asked his teacher, a gentle, elderly nun named Shiori. She smiled and said softly, "Perhaps it is not the cloud that's stuck." Tamo looked confused. "But I can see it, day and night." Shiori led him to a still pond near the edge of the temple and said, "Look." In the water, the cloud hung perfectly still, its reflection sharp and dark. But as Tamo stared, he saw something else, the breeze causing ripples across the surface. The reflection began to blur, then dissolve. The cloud in the water disappeared, even though the real one still hovered above. Shiori spoke gently. "The cloud may linger in the sky, but it's your mind that keeps holding it. Let go of the need for it to pass, and it will stop troubling you, even if it remains." Tamo stood quietly, the wind brushing his face. For the first time in days, he took a deep breath. The cloud was still there, but it no longer pressed on his heart. He returned to the temple and bowed in gratitude, not because the sky had cleared, but because his mind had. Moral of the story: We wait for certain feelings, thoughts, or situations to pass before we allow ourselves peace. But sometimes the cloud stays. Still, peace is possible not by changing the sky, but by loosening our grip on it. When we stop demanding that the cloud move, we realize it was never blocking the sun, only our mind was. The next story is called Shuichi's Whisper to a Cracked Bowl. Shuichi was a humble monk who lived alone on the far edge of a mountain forest. His life was quiet, tended a small garden, offered incense each morning, and chanted sutras to the wind. He spoke little, but those who visited him felt a deep peace in his presence, like standing near still water. Among his few belongings was a simple clay bowl. It was old and worn, with a long crack running down its side. It had belonged to his teacher, who had given it to him years ago without a word. Shuichi never replaced it. He used it daily to hold rice, to drink tea, to scoop rainwater. Over time, the bowl became not just an object, but a companion. One day, while washing it at the stream, the bowl slipped from his hands. It fell onto the stones with a soft thud, the crack deepening, a small piece breaking loose. Shuichi stared at it for a long time. He did not cry, he did not curse. Instead, he sat down beside it, cupped the broken piece in his hand, and whispered, "Thank you." A young traveler who had been passing through and witnessed this was puzzled. He approached and asked, "Why do you thank something that has just broken?" Shuichi smiled gently, holding the bowl with care. "Because it served with all its strength. It held rice and tea. It carried water for flowers. It cracked long ago, yet it kept holding on. And now, it has let go." The traveler sat beside him, suddenly quiet. Shuichi added, "We all carry cracks, wounds, things we think make us weak. But sometimes what's cracked isn't broken. It's softened. It's lived. And when it finally breaks, it teaches us one more thing: how to release with grace." The sun filtered through the trees. The sound of water running over stones became the only voice. Shuichi placed the broken piece on the ground like an offering and carried the rest of the bowl back to his hut, not as something ruined, but as something complete. Moral of the story: even what is cracked can still hold. And when it no longer can, it teaches us how to bow to change. There is beauty in what has been worn, touched, and used with care. Letting go does not mean losing it, can also mean honoring. Sometimes, the softest whispers of wisdom come from what has quietly endured. The next story is called The Dream of the Bodhi Tree Walking. In a quiet monastery by the riverbank, a devoted monk named Haru spent his life in services, weeping paths, preparing meals, and meditating beneath the trees. Though humble and kind, Haru held a silent hope in his heart that one day he might sit beneath the great Bodhi tree itself, as the Buddha had, and find true awakening. He often dreamed of traveling to Bodh Gaya, where the sacred tree still stood. But life passed slowly. His duties kept him rooted in place. He began to believe that enlightenment was always somewhere else, always far from where he was. One evening, after a long day of work, Haru sat in stillness beneath the temple's old fig tree. The wind was soft, the river murmured gently, and his eyes grew heavy with sleep. In the hush of night, he dreamed. In the dream, he stood beneath the vast Bodhi tree. Its leaves shimmered like gold in moonlight. But then, something strange happened. The tree began to move not its branches, but its roots. Slowly, silently, it pulled itself from the earth and began to walk. Not away from him, but toward him. Haru watched in awe as the great tree walked through rivers and valleys, over mountains and forests. Wherever it stepped, the earth became still. Wherever it passed, suffering softened. Finally, the tree stopped just before him. Its roots curled around his feet, as if embracing him. A voice rose not loud, but like the wind through leaves. You waited for me, but I was always here." Haru woke with tears in his eyes. The morning sun had begun to rise, painting the fig tree in soft gold. He looked up through its branches and for the first time saw it clearly, not as just a tree, but as presence, as now. From that day on, Haru never again longed to go elsewhere. He sat beneath that fig tree every morning, not to chase awakening, but to remember he was never separate from it. Moral of the story: we often believe peace lies far away, in distant places or future moments. But awakening isn't waiting at the end of a journey. It walks quietly toward us in every breath. The Bodhi tree doesn't need to be found. It is already beneath your feet, rooted in this very moment. The next story is called The Wind That Took the Master's Voice. In the dry hills of northern China, there was once a Zen master named Tianren. He was known across the land for his teachings, clear, simple, and direct. Many traveled long distances just to hear him speak, believing that even a single sentence could awaken the heart. His voice had a calm strength to it, like a bell rung slowly at dawn. But in his later years, Tianren fell ill. One spring morning, he awoke and found his voice gone. No pain, no fever, only silence. The doctors came, but there was no cure. Just a sudden stillness, as if the wind itself had swept his voice away in the night. The monks were heartbroken. Some cried, others begged him to write down his final teachings. "Master," they pleaded, "what will we do without your words? How will we learn?" Tianren simply smiled. From that day forward, he taught without speaking. He sat in the meditation hall day after day, motionless except for his breath. When monks approached him with questions, he would look into their eyes. Sometimes he would gesture toward the trees outside, or place a hand over his heart, or simply remain still. The students began to feel something strange, something deeper than explanation. One morning, a young monk came to him in tears. "I don't understand anything anymore," he said. "When you spoke, I felt clear. Now I feel lost." Tianren gently took the monk's hand and led him outside. A strong wind had picked up, shaking the trees, lifting dust from the earth. The master stood beneath a tall pine, closed his eyes, and let the wind move through his robes, his hair, his silence. The monk stood beside him, confused, then watched the branches sway, the sky shift, the dust swirl. In the sound of the wind, he heard something strange. Not words, but a message. Not language, but life. And in that moment, he understood. Sometimes the greatest teaching is not spoken, it is felt. Moral of the story: words can guide, but silence can awaken. When we stop clinging to voices, explanations, and form, we begin to hear what has always been speaking in the wind, in the breath, in stillness itself. A lost voice may not be a loss at all, but a deeper invitation to listen. The next story is called A Fly on the Buddha's Palm. In the cool stillness of a stone hall, a marble statue of the Buddha sat in perfect meditation. Generations of monks had come and gone, bowing before it, chanting, sitting quietly at its feet. It was said that the statue held a special energy, peaceful, unmoving, beyond time. One hot summer afternoon, a novice monk named Kiku sat before the statue, restless and tired. His legs ached from sitting. His thoughts buzzed like bees. Frustrated, he opened his eyes and noticed a small fly landing on the Buddha's open palm. It rubbed its legs, cleaned its wings, and moved in slow circles around the fingers carved from stone. Kiku scoffed to himself. "Even this fly has found peace," he thought bitterly, "while I sit here full of chaos." He watched the fly more closely. It didn't rush. It didn't try to leave. It simply stayed resting in the Buddha's palm as if it belonged there. A senior monk quietly walked in and noticed Kiku staring. "What are you looking at?" he asked. Kiku pointed. "That fly," he said. It seems more enlightened than I am. It's resting on the Buddha's palm as if nothing in the world troubles it." The old monk smiled. "Then let it be your teacher." Kiku looked confused. "A teacher?" "Yes," the monk said. "That fly doesn't carry the past. It doesn't chase the future. It isn't trying to understand Zen or master the breath. It's simply here. It rests without worry. It trusts the hand it sits in." The words sank deep into Kiku's heart. He looked again at the fly. It hadn't moved. The stone palm supported it completely, without condition, without effort. He realized he had spent all his time trying to reach the Buddha, trying to grasp stillness as if it was something far away. But the fly, with no teachings, no meditation cushion, no goals, had landed right in the heart of it, and stayed. That day, Kiku stopped trying so hard. He sat again, but now his effort softened. He let himself be held by the moment, like the fly resting in the Buddha's palm. Moral of the story: peace is not earned by struggle. The mind that lets go, even for a moment, finds it already resting in the arms of stillness. Like a tiny fly, we need not understand the truth to be carried by it. We need only land where we are and stay. The next story is called "The Candle That Forgot It Was Fire." In a small Zen temple tucked between tall cedar trees, there stood an old wooden altar with a single white candle. Every evening, as the sky turned deep blue and shadows grew long, a monk would light this candle in silence. Its warm glow would fill the meditation hall, casting gentle light over the faces of those seated in stillness. Over time, stories began to form about this candle. New monks whispered that it had never once gone out early, even in strong wind. Some believed it carried the spirit of a great teacher. Others said it held the light of wisdom itself. But one evening, something strange happened. The candle newly replaced after the last one burned, down refused to light. The monk tried again. The wick caught a tiny spark, then faded. The others watched, uncertain. Was this a sign? A bad omen? That night, the head monk gathered everyone and said, "We've given the candle too much power. We've forgotten what it truly is." A young monk, confused, asked, "Isn't the candle the light?" The master shook his head gently. "No, the candle holds the fire, but it is not the fire. The fire cannot be owned. It cannot be captured. When the flame burns, the candle gives itself completely. But the flame comes from something deeper, from the spark, from the breath, from the now." He paused, holding the unlit candle in his palm. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we forget our own nature. We think we are the wax, the shape, the name. But inside each of us is the same fire that lights the world. We just forget." The hall fell into silence. The next morning, no one relit the candle. Instead, they sat in the soft morning sun, breathing together, each becoming their own light, no longer needing wax to remember what they were. Moral of the story: we often mistake our outer form for who we are, but beneath the shape, the name, and the roles we play, there is something eternal, a quiet fire, a living presence. When we forget it, we feel small. But when we remember, even for a moment, we shine without effort. The candle is not the fire, and yet the fire is always within. The next story is called Dongshan's 5 Mirrors in Fog. Master Dongshan, the founder of the Caodong school of Zen, was known for his subtle teachings, gentle, poetic, and layered like mist on water. One of his most mysterious lessons was the 5 ranks, sometimes spoken of as 5 mirrors. Each mirror reflected a different way of seeing the self, the world, and awakening. But Dongshan rarely explained them. Instead, he waited for his students to discover their meaning, not through words, but through life. One rainy season, the mountains were blanketed in fog. Days passed without sunlight. The temple walls dripped with moisture, and the sky remained wrapped in thick white silence. The monks grew weary and restless, longing for clarity. One evening, Dongshan invited 5 students to the main hall. There, lit by a single candle, stood 5 mirrors each of different size, shape, and shade. He said nothing, only motioned for them to sit. The fog outside pressed against the windows. Inside, the mirrors stood still. One was bright and clear, another was dark and hard to see through. One reflected everything, even the flicker of the candle. Another showed nothing at all. The last was cracked, its reflection broken, yet strangely beautiful. The students waited for Dongshan to speak. Finally, one asked, "Master, what are we meant to see?" Dongshan walked slowly past the mirrors. He pointed first to the clearest one. "This is the mirror of form where the world is sharp and things seem separate." He pointed to the darkest. "This is the mirror of emptiness, where nothing has shape, yet everything rests." "At the third," he whispered, "this one shows form within emptiness, where light and shadow dance. At the blank mirror, here the world falls away, and only stillness remains." Then he touched the cracked one, his finger resting gently on the fracture. "And this one shows the truth living inside imperfection. The broken mirror is still a mirror." He turned to the students. "We walk through all of these, sometimes one, sometimes many. But when fog covers the path, it's not the mirror that fails, it's the eye that seeks too quickly." The candle flickered, the fog pressed in, the room was silent, but now full. Moral of the story: the mind tries to grasp truth like reaching for reflections in glass. But clarity comes not from choosing the right mirror, but from standing still long enough to see what each offers. Even in the fog, the mirror reflects. Even when cracked, it reveals. And when we stop searching for the perfect image, we begin to see ourselves. The next story is called "The Boy Who Buried the Zen Master's Shadow." In a remote village surrounded by pine-covered hills, there lived a boy named Nari. His parents were caretakers of a small temple where an old Zen master, Roshi Kenta, had chosen to spend his final years in silence. The villagers feared Roshi. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in riddles. But young Nari was curious, not afraid. He often brought the master rice or tea, hoping one day he might hear the secret of Zen. Roshi never gave him an answer, only a quiet gaze and the soft sound of breath moving in and out. But Nari noticed something else. Every evening, as the sun dipped low, Roshi would walk outside and stand in the courtyard, letting his shadow stretch across the earth. He stood still, facing west, his shadow reaching long and thin over the stones. One day, Nari finally asked, "Why do you always watch your shadow?" The old master looked at the boy and said, "I watch it to see if it still owns me." The boy didn't understand. "How can a shadow own you?" Roshi knelt down and whispered, "The shadow is everything we carry but do not see: our fears, our pride, our past. Some people never look at theirs. Some chase it, some run from it, but few ever make peace with it." That night, Roshi passed away quietly in his sleep. The villagers mourned. Some wept, some offered incense. But Nari did something different. At sunset, he returned to the courtyard where the master used to stand. He brought a small spade and began digging where the shadow had always fallen. Carefully, silently, he placed a stone marker in the hole and covered it with earth. A monk passing by asked, "What are you doing, child?" Nari answered, "I'm burying his shadow. He no longer needs it, and maybe neither do I." He sat there for a long time as the sky turned golden, letting the wind pass through him, feeling the warmth of a sun that no longer cast any shadow at all. Moral of the story: we all carry shadows, memories, habits, regrets. But we are not our shadows. When we stop fearing them, chasing them, or hiding from them, we begin to see clearly. And sometimes, in stillness, we realize, to live fully in the present, we must lay the past gently to rest. Even the deepest shadow can be buried by the light. The next story is called Kaizen's Smile Beneath the Avalanche. High in the mountains of northern Japan, a Zen hermit named Kaizen lived alone in a small hut carved into the side of a slope. His life was simple: chopping wood, meditating by the fire, melting snow for water. Villagers below spoke of him as strange but kind, a man who smiled often and rarely spoke. He was once a monk in a great temple, but had quietly walked away years ago. No one knew why. One winter, a storm swept over the mountain with brutal force. For 3 days, snow fell endlessly. Trees bent and cracked under the weight. The path to Kaizen's hut disappeared. On the 4th day, a loud rumble echoed through the valley. A thunderous avalanche poured down the mountainside, swallowing trees, stones, and silence. The villagers feared the worst. Kaizen's hut was on that slope, they said. No one could have survived. When the storm cleared, a small group climbed up to see what remained. The path was buried, the trees flattened. Hours passed as they dug through snow and debris with frozen hands. Then someone gasped, a faint sound like laughter. They dug faster. Beneath a broken beam of the collapsed hut, half buried in snow, they found Kaizen, alive, bruised, cold, but smiling, his eyes bright, his breath calm. His hands were pressed together in gasho. When they pulled him free, one villager wept and asked, How can you smile? You were nearly crushed." Kaizen answered softly, "The mountain did what it must, so did the snow, and I what I could. The rest is wind." They stared at him, stunned. He continued, "As the roof fell, I thought, so this is how the body ends. But even then, there was nothing wrong in the sky, nothing wrong in the snow, just one moment giving itself to the next, and within that, there was peace." He closed his eyes and whispered, "Even under snow, the heart can bow." From that day on, people stopped calling him strange. They began to call him wise. Moral of the story: peace is not the absence of disaster, it is the presence of acceptance. When life buries us, the mind may panic, but the heart still knows how to bow. Even beneath the weight of everything falling, a quiet smile can rise, not from denial, but from seeing clearly that nothing needs to be resisted, not even the avalanche. The next story is called "The Cup That Was Always Full Yet Always Empty." In a quiet Zen temple nestled between the sea and the mountains, there lived an old monk named Tetsuo. He was known for his kindness, his laughter, and most of all for a simple porcelain teacup that never left his side. The cup was plain, with a fine crack running through its side, but Tetsuo used it every day. Morning and night, he drank from it always with a peaceful smile. Monks and visitors often noticed the cup. They would ask, "Why do you use that old thing? It's cracked. Doesn't it leak?" Tetsuo would chuckle softly and say, "It's the perfect cup, always full, yet always empty." None quite understood what he meant. One day, a scholar arrived at the temple, seeking deep teachings. He had studied sutras, debated masters, and filled countless notebooks. But his heart felt heavy, always chasing something, never content. He came to Tetsuo, hoping for a final answer, something to complete the puzzle. The old monk welcomed him warmly and offered tea. As they sat beneath a blossoming plum tree, Tetsuo carefully poured the tea into his cracked cup. The scholar noticed a few drops escaping from the side and said with concern, "Your tea is leaking, master." Tetsuo smiled. "Yes, just enough to remind me not to hold too tightly." Then he offered the same cup to the scholar. The man hesitated. "But it's cracked. It can't be full." Tetsuo replied, "It is full now, as you hold it, and it will be empty soon." Isn't that the truth of all things? The scholar paused. Something in those simple words pierced his chest. He realized how tightly he had been gripping life knowledge, goals, identity, always trying to fill himself, never allowing emptiness. Tetsuo continued, "We fear being empty, but only an empty cup can receive, and we fear being full because we don't want to lose. But to pour ourselves out is the way of the path." The tea was gone, the cup was empty, and yet something in the scholar's heart felt full for the first time. Moral of the story: life flows between fullness and emptiness, just like tea in a cup. When we try to hold too much, we miss the joy of the moment. But when we embrace the fragile, fleeting nature of things, we learn to receive, to let go, and to begin again. A cracked cup still holds truth just enough to wake us up. The next story is called The Bamboo That Didn't Bend or Break. In a quiet village surrounded by deep forests and rice fields, a Zen master named Ryotan taught at a humble temple made of wood and stone. Every morning, he would walk the narrow paths through a nearby bamboo grove. The villagers often saw him there, moving slowly, hands behind his back, pausing to watch the wind pass through the tall green stalks. One summer, a great storm swept across the valley. Rain fell without rest, winds howled like spirits, trees were uprooted, homes were damaged. The bamboo grove, once calm and tall, was torn by the storm's fury. When the sun returned, many villagers went to see the damage. The grove looked wounded, leaves were scattered. Some bamboo had bent low, others swayed gently, already rising again. But one stalk, taller and thicker than the rest, stood perfectly straight, untouched by the wind. At first, people praised it. "Look," they said, "this one never bent. So strong." But days later, that same stalk began to split. A crack appeared at its base. Then it fell, breaking completely. When Master Ryotan returned to the grove, he stopped and knelt by the fallen stalk. A young monk beside him asked, "Master, why did this one fall? It was the strongest." Ryotan touched the cracked bamboo gently and said, "Because it refused to yield." The monk looked puzzled. Ryotan continued, "The others bent with the storm. They gave themselves to the wind, and so they survived. This one resisted. It held itself too tightly, and so it broke." The monk sat in silence, watching the wind rustle the surviving bamboo. It danced softly, like breath. Ryotan spoke once more, "We are not meant to be rigid. Even strength must know when to bow. If you grip too hard to your beliefs, your pride, your need to be right, the storms of life will break you. But if you know how to bend, how to let go, and move with what comes, you will rise again." And then he stood, bowed to the grove, and walked on. Moral of the story: true strength is not in standing firm no matter what, but in knowing when to yield. Life will bring winds that test us, but those who bend without losing their roots remain unbroken. The heart that can bow, even in pain, is the heart that will rise again. The next story is called The Koan That Wasn't Written. In a mountain monastery draped in mists and pine, a well-known Zen master named Jinto was asked to compose a final koan before his death. His disciples believed that his last teaching would be his greatest, something profound, something worthy of being remembered for generations. For days, Jinto remained alone in his room. He lit incense, meditated, and sat with a blank parchment before him. His inkbrush waited, untouched. The younger monks grew restless. "Why won't he write?" they whispered. "Is he waiting for some revelation?" On the third day, Jinto called his students to gather. They bowed in reverence, eyes full of expectation. Before them, he held up the parchment, still completely blank. Gasps spread through the room. "Master, there is nothing on it." Jinto smiled, soft and wide. "Exactly. A student stepped forward, confused. "But we came here to receive your final koan. Something to study, to carry, to awaken us." Jinto nodded. "And so I have given it. But there are no words." He leaned forward, his voice like wind through bamboo. "The greatest koan is the one that cannot be written. Because your mind already rushes to read, to solve, to understand. That very movement is the barrier." Silence followed, heavy and still. Some frowned, unsure. Others sat down slowly, feeling something stir inside that had no name. Jinto continued, "Every koan you've read was never about the words. They are fingers pointing to the moon. But this," he held up the blank parchment, "this points to what cannot be seen. The space before the thought, the moment before the mind grabs." He bowed, gently placed the parchment on the altar, and walked out into the fog, never to return. That night, none of the monks slept. They sat in silence beside the blank scroll, watching their own thoughts rise and fall, unable to hold on to anything. And in that quiet, something opened. Not understanding, not knowledge, just presence. Moral of the story: the deepest truths can't be written down or spoken. They are found in the stillness between words, in the silence that remains when the mind stops grasping. The koan that wasn't written lives in that space, inviting us to stop searching and simply wake up. The next story is called "The Dog That Barked at No One." In a quiet Zen temple tucked beneath the cliffs of the southern coast, there lived an old temple dog named Jiki. He was not fierce or loud, but every day, just before sunset, he would sit near the front gate and bark, not at people, not at passing animals, but at something no one could see. The monks grew used to it. Tourists thought it strange, but Jiki never missed a day. One evening, a young monk named Rensu finally asked the abbot, "Why does Jiki bark when there's no one there?" The abbot looked up from his sweeping and said, "Perhaps he is not barking at someone. Perhaps he is barking at what lives in silence." Rensu frowned. "But there's nothing there." The abbot nodded. "And yet, he sees something." That night, Rensu decided to sit near Jiki at sunset. As the orange light poured across the stone steps, the old dog sat upright, ears still, eyes alert. Then, as if on cue, he barked 3 sharp barks into the empty air. Rensu looked where the dog looked. There was nothing, no shadow, no shape, just the wind curling over the sea and the stillness of the fading day. And yet something stirred in Rensu's chest, a tightness, a kind of ache he couldn't name. He stayed for days, watching Jiki bark. Always at the same time, always into the same invisible space. Slowly, the young monk began to understand. Jiki wasn't barking at danger or ghosts. He was responding to something humans rarely notice, the quiet presence of everything passing, the ending of the day, the softness of now slipping into then, the ache of impermanence. Jiki was barking, not to chase it away, but to greet it, to announce that he was awake, that he noticed. On the 7th evening, Rensu sat beside him and whispered, "I see it too." He did not bark. He simply placed his hand on the old dog's back and watched the sun fall without clinging to it. Moral of the story: not all cries are for warning. Sometimes they are a call to witness. A dog barking at nothing may be more present than we are. When we stop demanding proof and start listening with the heart, we too can hear the sound of things passing and remember that even silence has a voice. The next story is called "When the Bell Rang Without a Sound." In a remote Zen temple carved into the cliffs above the sea, there hung a great bronze bell. It was said to be ancient older than the temple itself. Each morning before sunrise, the bell would ring once, calling the monks to meditation. Its sound was deep and long, echoing across the waves, touching even the smallest village on the shore. One morning, just before dawn, the temple grounds were wrapped in a heavy fog. The air was so still it felt like time had stopped. A young monk named Nao was chosen to ring the bell. He approached with care, bowed before it, and lifted the wooden striker. But something inside him hesitated. He had been struggling. His meditations were filled with noise memories, regrets, desires, thoughts spinning endlessly. No matter how still he sat, his mind raced. That morning, standing before the bell, Nao thought, "What good is a sound if it cannot quiet the storm within me?" He lowered the striker. He did not strike the bell. Instead, he closed his eyes and placed both hands gently on the cold metal. He listened, not for the bell, but for something deeper. The fog surrounded him. The sea below moved like a slow breath. And in that silence, something strange happened. The monks in their rooms all sat upright. Something had stirred them. Something had called. They arrived in the meditation hall to find Nao still standing before the bell, unmoving. The bell had not rung, and yet each monk felt as if it had. The abbot stepped forward, his eyes warm. "Why didn't you strike it?" Nao whispered, "Because today I needed to hear the silence instead." The abbot smiled, and so did we. From then on, once each month, the bell would be honored in silence. No sound, just presence. And that day became known as the morning without a sound. Moral of the story: not all bells are heard with the ears. Some ring only in the heart. In our search for clarity, we often wait for loud signs or answers, but the deepest call to awakening may come in perfect stillness. When we listen not for sound but for silence, we hear the world in a new way that has always been calling us home. The next story is called The Cat That Meditated with the Ancients. At a quiet Zen temple surrounded by cedar trees and stones worn smooth by time, there lived a cat named Tama. She had wandered into the temple as a kitten and never left. The monks said she had chosen the path herself. She did not chase mice. She did not meow for food. Instead, Tama followed the monks wherever they went, especially into the meditation hall. When the bell rang and the monks took their seats, Tama would walk slowly to the front of the hall, curl her tail around her feet, and sit perfectly still, eyes half closed, breath soft and slow. She would remain this way for the full sitting, never moving, never distracted. Not once did she wander, even as seasons changed and new monks came and went. One morning, a novice monk asked the old teacher, "Master, why does the cat sit with us? She doesn't understand Zen." The master smiled. "Are you sure?" The novice laughed. "But she's just a cat." The master nodded. "Yes, and perhaps for that reason, she understands more than we do." The novice was puzzled. The master explained, "She does not meditate to become something. She does not hope to be enlightened. She is not thinking of what comes next or what came before. She simply sits. That is true meditation." That evening, the novice watched Tama more carefully. The way her body settled without effort. The way her breath seemed to disappear. The way she sat, not to impress, not to achieve, but simply to be. There was nothing missing in her posture, no grasping in her stillness. She was fully present and completely free. As weeks passed, the novice began to sit differently. He no longer strained to silence his mind. He didn't push away thoughts or chase perfect posture. Instead, he sat like Tama, gentle, present, simply being with what was. On the wall of the meditation hall, a scroll read, "Sit like a mountain, breathe like the wind." But now the novice thought, or simply sit like the cat. Moral of the story: true meditation is not about effort, it is about presence. The mind that does not reach or resist becomes naturally still. Like a cat sitting in the sun, peace arises not from control, but from simply being. When we stop trying to meditate and begin to just sit, the ancient silence returns and we remember we were never apart from it. The next story is called The Silence After the Master Fell Asleep. In a small temple by a winding river, an old Zen master named Ichiro was known not just for his wisdom, but for his gentleness. He had taught hundreds of students over the years, but as he aged, his teachings became simpler, fewer words, more pauses, and long moments of sitting in silence. One day, during a late afternoon teaching, the sun casting long golden shadows across the tatami floor, the master gathered the monks into the main hall. Everyone expected a talk, a story, a koan to wrestle with. Instead, Ichiro simply closed his eyes and breathed quietly. The room was perfectly still. The young monks sat upright, waiting patiently. Minutes passed, then more. No words came. Finally, after nearly an hour, a soft snore escaped from the master's lips. He had fallen asleep seated, dignified, peaceful. His head bowed slightly, his breath even. The monks looked around, unsure. Some were amused. Others felt awkward. A few giggled under their robes, but no one moved. Then something unexpected happened. As the minutes stretched on, a profound stillness filled the room, not just quiet, but a living, breathing presence. The kind that touches you without a sound. The kind that makes you aware of every breath, every heartbeat, the weight of your own body, and the space around it. There was no lesson being given, and yet something powerful was happening. One monk, the youngest, began to cry, not from sadness, but from something he didn't have words for. A kind of recognition, a kind of homecoming. Eventually, the master stirred awake, slowly opening his eyes. He looked around and saw the room still as stone, every face soft, every body still grounded in the moment. He smiled gently and said, "Ah, good, you heard it." No one asked what he meant. They knew. Moral of the story: not all teachings come in words. Sometimes the deepest lessons arrive wrapped in silence. We spend our lives trying to understand, to explain, to seek, but presence asks for none of that. In the stillness that follows what seems like nothing, something awakens. When the master fell asleep, the Dharma continued to speak. The next story is called The Rice That Taught Impermanence. In a small rural temple nestled between golden fields, a young monk named Nari was given the daily task of preparing the rice. It was a quiet job, repetitive and simple: washing, measuring, boiling. At first, Nari found peace in it. The warmth of the pot, the rhythm of rinsing, the steam rising slowly from the bowlet, all felt sacred. But over time, something changed. Nari began to feel frustration creeping in. Every day it's the same, he thought. Wash the rice, cook the rice, eat the rice, then do it again. Is this all Zen is? His heart longed for something greater, some spiritual fire, some deep moment of realization. The rice just seemed too ordinary. One morning, after a restless night of thoughts, Nari was washing the grains at the temple well when the abbot, an old and quiet man, walked by. Seeing Nari's heavy face, he asked, "What burdens your bowl today?" Nari replied, "I keep cooking rice, but I don't feel any closer to awakening. Every grain is the same. Nothing ever changes." The abbot smiled and sat beside him. He reached into the bowl, lifted a handful of wet rice, and let the grains fall slowly through his fingers. "Look again," he said. "Do you really believe nothing changes?" He picked up one grain and held it to the light. This was once seed, then plant, then harvest, now food. Soon it will become breath, blood, thought, and then gone. Every grain tells the whole story of impermanence. Nari stared at the bowl, the thousands of tiny white grains. He had seen them every day, yet never truly seen them. Each one had lived and died 1,000 times to become what it was. And here he wastes treating it as ordinary. That evening, he cooked the rice with new eyes. As he stirred the pot, he whispered quietly, "You have come so far, and now you will disappear again." He didn't need a sacred moment. It was already in his hands. Moral of the story: we wait for awakening to strike like lightning, but sometimes it sits quietly in a bowl of rice. Nothing is truly ordinary when seen with clear eyes. Everything changes, everything passes. But within that passing, there is something beautiful, quiet reminder that this moment, too, is sacred. The next story is called The Monastery with No Walls. There was once a traveler named Soma who had spent years searching for a true Zen teacher. He walked through deserts, climbed mountains, and visited countless temples. Yet everywhere he went, he found rules, rituals, and walls, always walls. High stone boundaries separating sacred from ordinary, teacher from student, silence from speech. One day, weary and doubtful, Soma heard of a mysterious master who lived in a monastery with no walls. Intrigued and confused, he followed the directions through a forest path, expecting to find at least a gate, or a hall, or a garden. But when he arrived, there was nothing. Only trees, wind, open sky. He wandered deeper, unsure, until he saw an old man sitting on a fallen log, sipping tea, barefoot, laughing quietly to himself. Soma bowed and asked, "Master, is this the monastery?" The man nodded. "It is, but there are no buildings." "Correct. No temple? No need. No gate, no shrine, no bell. All here," the master said, tapping his chest. Soma frowned. "But how can a monastery exist without walls, without form? What keeps it together?" The master looked up at the sky, then gestured all around. "The present moment has no walls, yet it holds everything. Why build a prison to protect the wind?" Soma sat down, still unsure. He asked, "Then what is the practice here?" The master smiled. "To be here, fully, with whatever comes. To drink your tea while drinking it. To walk as if the earth is sacred. To see no inside, no outside. Only this." That evening, Soma sat beneath the stars, no roof above him, no altar before him, and yet he felt something he hadn't felt in any temple: freedom, clarity, stillness. Nothing was marked holy, and yet everything was. He had finally entered the monastery that had always been waiting. Moral of the story: we often believe we need walls, rituals, or places to find peace. But true practice begins when we stop dividing the sacred from the ordinary. The present moment is the real temple. When we let go of needing boundaries, we realize we are already inside the monastery with no walls and no end. The next story is called The Bodhisattva Who Never Spoke. In a temple carved into the cliffs of a distant land, there was a statue unlike any other. It was not gold or grand. It didn't sit on a lotus or raise a hand in blessing. Instead, it stood in the far corner of the meditation hall, carved from weathered stone, small and plain. Its eyes were closed. Its mouth was sealed. The monks called it the Silent One, Bodhisattva Who Never Spoke. No one remembered where the statue came from. It had no inscription, no story, no name from scripture. But over the years, monks and wanderers alike found themselves drawn to it. People sat near it without knowing why. Some cried, some sat in stillness for hours, and some left without speaking a word. A young monk named Lian once asked the head teacher, "Why do people come to a statue that says nothing?" The teacher replied, "Because silence speaks to what words cannot touch." Lian frowned. "But shouldn't a bodhisattva teach with compassion, with guidance, with voice?" The teacher smiled and said, "Look again." So Lian did. Every day he sat before the statue, waiting for something, a sign, a feeling, a thought. At first he grew impatient. Nothing happened. No insight, no warmth, no wisdom, just a quiet stone figure and the sound of his own breathing. But slowly, something began to change in the statue, but in Lian. He stopped expecting. He stopped waiting. He began to notice the small things, the way light shifted across the bodhisattva's face as the sun moved, the way his own mind grew quiet in the presence of stillness, the way peace settled when no words were asked for. One day he whispered, "You never speak, and yet I finally hear." He bowed deeply, not to stone, but to the space the silence had opened within him. Years later, when Lian became a teacher himself, he kept no altar, no books in his room, only a small stone figure, eyes closed, mouth sealed. Moral of the story: some truths cannot be taught with words. The deepest wisdom is not always spoken, but felt in the stillness between thoughts, in the presence that asks for nothing. A bodhisattva who never speaks teaches the most important lesson: that silence too can be love. And within that silence, we meet what we've been searching for all along. The next story is called The Echo That Pointed to the Present. In a narrow valley surrounded by cliffs and pine trees, there was a hidden Zen retreat where students came to train in deep silence. The sound of wind, footsteps, and breath carried clearly in the open air. Even the smallest whisper could be heard bouncing off the rocks. Among the students was a young man named Kaoru. He was clever, sharp, and full of questions, but he was always thinking of what came next. Every task, every meditation, every moment, his mind would race ahead. What's the next step? What's the deeper level? When will I awaken? One day, the master sent Kaoru to gather water from the stream at the base of the valley. The path was steep and winding, with voices echoing across the cliffs. As Kaoru walked, he muttered to himself, "How long must I wait to understand? How far do I still need to go?" To his surprise, a voice echoed back, "How far do I still need to go?" He paused, confused. "I'm just wondering where this path leads." The rocks returned his voice again, "Where this path leads." Frustrated, Kaoru shouted, "Stop repeating me." The echo answered calmly, "Stop repeating me." He stood still. The wind quieted, the stream whispered below. Then something shifted inside him. The echo hadn't mocked him, it had mirrored him. It had spoken only what he had spoken. It gave back exactly what he gave out. He realized the world, like the echo, reflects the mind. When we speak from confusion, confusion returns. When we chase the future, we lose the ground beneath us. The present had been calling back all along. He had just mistaken it for noise. He sat down right there on the trail. For the first time, he didn't try to get anywhere. He listened to the wind, the silence, the rhythm of his own breath. The echo was still, because he was. Later, he returned to the retreat without water, but with something deeper: presence. Moral of the story: life echoes what we bring to it. If we rush, it rushes back. If we worry, it worries louder. But when we pause, when we listen without pushing or chasing, we hear something deeper. The present is always speaking. It sounds like silence. It feels like now, and it waits patiently for us to finally hear it. The next story is called The Stone That Cried Once Every Century. In a forgotten valley wrapped in mist and moss, there sat a large stone at the base of an ancient waterfall. No carvings marked it. No offerings were left beside it. Travelers often passed without noticing. To most, it was just a rock, silent, still and unmoving. But the monks of a nearby hermitage whispered of its secret, that once every 100 years, when no one was watching, the stone wept a single tear. No one had ever seen it happen, and no one had ever heard the sound. but the story lived on, passed from teacher to student like a hidden verse. A young monk named Yuto became obsessed with the tale. He begged his master for permission to keep vigil by the stone, to witness the moment of its tear. The master warned him gently, "Be careful. Some truths can only be seen when you stop trying to see them." But Yuto insisted, so he went. He built a small shelter nearby and began his watch. Day after day, season after season, he sat. Years passed. The stone remained as it always was, cold, quiet, unchanging. Yuto grew older, his hair turned grey, his bones ached from sitting. Doubt crept into his heart. Maybe the story is only a myth, he thought. Still, he stayed. One winter night, snow fell soft across the valley. The waterfall slowed to a whisper. Yuto, now old, sat quietly with his hands folded. He no longer looked at the stone with hunger. He had stopped waiting. He had stopped needing. And in that moment, without movement, without sound, he felt something warm land on the back of his hand. He looked down. A drop, not from the sky, not from the stream, from the stone. Tears welled in his eyes, not from surprise, but from understanding. The stone had not waited a century. It had waited for silence, for presence, for someone to stop searching and simply be. Moral of the story: some truths cannot be rushed. They do not reveal themselves to eyes that grasp or hearts that demand. Like a stone that cries once every 100 years, the deepest moments of insight come when all seeking has fallen away. Only then, in quiet presence, does the world begin to speak, and sometimes even a stone weeps. The next story is called The Sandal That Found the Middle Way. In a quiet mountain village, where the roads were dusty and the sun carved long shadows, there lived a young monk named Renji. He was earnest, disciplined, and full of ambition. Every morning he swept the courtyard before dawn, recited sutras with intensity, and pushed himself to be the perfect monk. But Renji was never satisfied. If he sat for an hour, he would sit for 2 the next day. If he felt hunger, he would fast longer. If others smiled, he stayed serious. He believed the path to enlightenment must be steep, cold, and without comfort. One day, he walked miles down a rocky trail to visit an old master named Eijo, who was known to teach in riddles. The heat was heavy, and Renji's sandals were thin. Partway down the path, one sandal snapped. Still, Renji limped the rest of the way, barefoot, blisters forming on the sharp stones. When he arrived, Master Eijo looked at the broken sandal in his hand and said nothing. Instead, he poured tea and pointed to the bench. As they sat, Renji told him of his practice, his efforts, his pain, and how he was trying to do everything with maximum discipline. Eijo listened quietly. Then he held up the broken sandal and asked, "Why did you not stop to fix this?" Renji answered, "Because I didn't want to slow down. I needed to keep going. Pain is part of the path, isn't it?" The master smiled. "Sometimes. But so is wisdom. Walking with broken things doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you bleed." Then he reached into a small wooden box and handed Renji a new pair of sandals, simple, sturdy, balanced. "These are not too tight, not too soft. They are made for walking, not for proving." Renji held the sandals in silence. Something in him softened. For the first time in years, he realized he had been trying to earn something that had never been denied. The path was not to punish the body or to escape it, but to walk with it, gently, attentively, in the middle. Moral of the story: discipline without kindness becomes cruelty. Comfort without clarity becomes laziness. The middle way is not weakness, it is wisdom in motion. Like a sandal that fits just right, it allows us to walk far without breaking. Enlightenment is not at the end of an extreme, but in the steady steps of balance. The next story is called When Buddha Took Off His Robes. It is said that long after his enlightenment, when the Buddha had already gathered many disciples and kings bowed at his feet, he once disappeared from the monastery without a word. No one knew where he had gone. The monks searched for him in forests, caves, and riversides. Days passed in silence. Then one morning, just before dawn, he returned barefoot, without bowl, without robes. His followers gasped. The great teacher stood before them not in his golden robes of peace, but wrapped in rags, his body covered in dust. He smiled, his eyes calm. Ananda, his closest disciple, stepped forward, shocked. "Master, what has happened to your robes? Where have you been?" Buddha sat beneath a tree and said softly, "I went walking." Ananda bowed deeply. "But without your robes, no one would know you are the Buddha." Buddha closed his eyes for a moment. Then they would have a chance to see something more important. The monks were confused. Buddha opened his hands, scarred and bare. Too often, people bow to what they see: the robe, the title, the idea of a perfect being. But today, I walked among them as no one, just another traveler on the road. Some shared food with me, some ignored me. One old woman gave me her last piece of bread, not knowing who I was. In that moment, she gave more than worship, she gave presence. The monks fell silent. Buddha continued, "Enlightenment is not worn. It is not draped in silk or praised with flowers. It is not in robes or rituals. It is in the way we see others. It is in how we walk, how we listen, how we give." He looked out at his disciples not as their master, but as a man, a human being who had let go of being anything else. And in that moment, many of them saw him more clearly than ever before. Moral of the story: we often dress truth in symbols, robes, titles, names, but awakening lives beneath all of them. It does not shine louder when praised or bowed to. It walks quietly, unnoticed, in simple clothes. When we let go of what enlightenment looks like, we may finally begin to feel what it truly is. The next story is called "The Laughter That Created a Temple." Long ago, in a dusty village where the earth cracked from heat and seasons passed without much notice, there lived a man named Gendo. He was not a monk, not a teacher, not even a student of the Dharma. He ran a small food stall near the market and was known mostly for one thing: his laugh. It wasn't polite or quiet. It burst from him like thunder after silence. It echoed through alleys and startled birds from rooftops. Children loved him. Elders smiled when they heard it. But others, especially those who considered themselves spiritual, found it annoying, even disrespectful. One day, a group of traveling monks came to town. They heard Gendo's laughter from across the square and turned to see him doubled over beside his stall, tears in his eyes, amused by something only he seemed to notice. One monk frowned. "He behaves like a fool. He laughs too much. How can a man like that ever awaken?" Their teacher, a gentle old nun named Amiko, said nothing. She simply walked toward Gendo and bowed. Startled, he paused mid-laugh and looked at her. "You are a real monk?" he asked, half giggling. She nodded. "And you," she said, "have the light of freedom in your lungs." He laughed even harder, this time falling backward onto a sack of rice. She sat beside him and laughed too. The villagers stared, so did the monks. When the laughter faded, Amiko looked at him and asked, "What were you laughing at?" He wiped a tear from his cheek and said, "Nothing, everything. The fly that won't leave my nose, the wind that flipped my soup bowl, my own mind thinking too much. What else is there?" She bowed again. "Would you teach at our temple?" He blinked. "Me? I've never studied anything." "You've studied joy," she said. "You've mastered presence." And so, a new temple was built not from stone, but from laughter. People gathered not for chants, but to remember how to be light again. Gendo never wore robes, never gave sermons. But his presence reminded people of something deeper than words, the freedom of being fully alive. Moral of the story: wisdom doesn't always wear a serious face. True awakening can sound like laughter. When joy comes from the heart, unchained and pure, it becomes a temple in itself, inviting others to sit, to smile, and to remember that the present moment is already enough. The next story is called The Master Who Gave Away Enlightenment. In a modest temple, far from the cities and their noise, lived an old Zen master named Jinto. He was known not for miracles or fame, but for his deep stillness and laughter that sounded like wind through trees. People traveled from distant lands to study with him, hoping to attain enlightenment, the great awakening they believed would change their lives forever. One day, a young seeker named Rei arrived, eyes burning with hunger. He bowed low before Jinto and said, "Master, I have read every sutra. I have meditated for years, but still I feel restless. Please grant me enlightenment." Jinto looked at him with soft eyes and said only, "Very well, come back tomorrow." Rei didn't sleep that night. He cleaned his robe, sat perfectly straight, and imagined how it would feel, this awakening he had longed for. He pictured golden light, deep silence, the end of all confusion. He believed that finally his mind would become pure and unshakable. The next morning, he returned to the master, heart pounding. Jinto reached into a small wooden box and pulled out a worn, folded cloth. Inside was a small, smooth stone with the word enlightenment carved into it. Without a word, he handed it to Rei. Rei stared at it, confused. "This is it?" Jinto nodded. "Yes. You asked for enlightenment. I have given it to you." Rei's hands trembled. "But it's just a stone. Nothing has changed inside me." Jinto smiled. "Then perhaps you did not want enlightenment. Perhaps you wanted a feeling, a sign, a moment that confirmed what you already believed. But truth is not a feeling. It cannot be given or held. Still, you asked, and I gave." Rei looked down at the stone again. Its surface was warm from the master's hand, and suddenly he felt foolish hand, then strangely free. He dropped the stone. It landed softly in the dirt. In that exact moment, the breeze picked up and a bird flew overhead. Rei breathed in deeply, for the first time, without chasing anything. And the master laughed. Moral of the story: we seek enlightenment as if it's a treasure to gain, but true awakening cannot be handed to us. It arises the moment we stop needing it to be something special. When the search ends, presence begins. And sometimes, the greatest gift a master can give is letting you see it was never missing. The next story is called The Master Who Gave Away Enlightenment. In a windswept temple by the edge of the desert lived a Zen master named Arata. He was known far and wide not just for his wisdom, but for something even stranger. He claimed he could give enlightenment away. Pilgrims traveled great distances to find him, each hoping to be the one who received it. They would sit before him, bow deeply and ask, "Master, please give me enlightenment." And Arata would smile, pour them tea and say, "Very well." But as they drank, nothing happened. There was no flash of light, no vision, no sudden truth. Disappointed, they would leave, muttering that it was just a trick. One day, a young woman named Aya came. She did not bow quickly. She did not ask right away. She simply sat beside him beneath a tree and said quietly, "If it can be given, I will accept it, but I do not expect it." Arata smiled. He handed her a stone. "This is it," he said. Aya looked at the stone in her hand. It was plain, rough, warm from the sun. She said nothing. She didn't ask for proof. She just held it gently. Arata nodded. "Then it's yours." Days passed. Aya remained at the temple. helping with chores, sitting in silence, sharing tea. She never mentioned the stone again. But something changed. She laughed more freely. She moved with lightness. She no longer seemed to be seeking anything at all. Another monk noticed and asked, "What did the master give you?" Aya smiled. "Nothing I can explain, only something I was finally ready to receive." The monk scoffed. Then it wasn't enlightenment. But Arata, overhearing, chuckled softly and said, "That's what everyone says until they stop needing to say anything at all." Moral of the story: enlightenment is not a prize to be earned or a secret to be unlocked. It cannot be taken, but it can be received. Often, it comes disguised as an ordinary moment, a simple gift, or a plain stone. When we stop demanding a thunderclap and start accepting what is, we may realize the light has already been handed to us many times, just waiting for us to hold it still. The next story is called The River That Refused to Flow Forward. In a distant land where mountains kissed the clouds, there flowed a river unlike any other. It wound its way through villages and forests, nourishing all it touched. But one day, something strange happened. As spring melted the snows, the river stopped moving. Birds circled above. Animals gathered by the banks in confusion. The water stilled, not frozen, just still. The villagers panicked. Crops began to wither. Boats stood motionless. They went to the mountain temple and pleaded with the old Zen master who lived there. "Please, speak to the river. Remind it of its purpose." The master walked to the river's edge alone. He bowed to the water and whispered, "Why do you not flow?" To his surprise, the river answered not with sound, but with feeling. A deep, quiet sorrow filled the air. "I am tired," the river said. "Tired of rushing, tired of always going forward. What lies ahead? The sea, dissolving into something bigger, something unknown. I want to stay. I want to rest." The master knelt. He placed his hand into the water. "Even rivers grieve," he said. "Even rivers fear." He stayed there for hours, saying nothing more, simply being with the stillness. The next morning, the villagers found the river moving again, not fast, not forceful, but gently, steadily, like a breath returning after a long pause. When asked what he had done, the master replied, "Nothing. I only listened." He looked at the young monks and said, "Do not scold the heart for stopping. Do not push the soul to rush. Even a river must sometimes pause to remember where it comes from. And only when it feels seen will it flow again." Moral of the story: we are told to always move forward, to keep going no matter what. But even the spirit, like the river, needs rest. Sometimes stillness is not weakness, it is healing. When we allow ourselves to pause, to listen, to feel deeply, we do not stop our journey, we reconnect with its source. And from that stillness, we can begin again. The next story is called The Fish Who Remembered Its Past Lives. In a deep and still pond hidden within a quiet forest, there lived an old fish named Kura. He was unlike the other fish, calmer, quieter, and often found floating near the surface with his eyes turned toward the sky. While others darted and played, Kura watched. When the rains came, he didn't hide. When food was scarce, he didn't panic. Some said he was odd. Others whispered that he had been this way forever. One evening, as the golden light of sunset touched the surface of the water, a young fish swam beside him and asked, "Why do you never rush like the rest of us? Don't you fear being left behind?" Kura blinked slowly and said, "Because I have already swum through lifetimes." The young fish tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Kura spoke softly. "Once I was a bird, flying through wide skies. Once I was a tree, holding still in the wind. Once I was a monk who sat beside a river, watching fish just like me. Each life, I chased something, flight, shelter, peace, but always I searched outside myself. The young fish was silent. Kura continued, "Now I remember. I remember the hunger, the fear, the striving. I remember how none of it brought peace. So in this life, I do not chase. I float. I breathe. I watch the sky move above me, and I am home." The young fish thought for a long time. "Do you miss the sky?" he asked. Kura smiled. "Sometimes. But now I know the sky is here too, reflected in the water, carried in each ripple. You don't need wings to feel freedom. You need stillness." For days after that, the young fish swam slower. He began to notice the way the lily pads moved, the way the insects danced on the surface, the way the moonlight touched everything without choosing. He didn't know if Kura truly remembered past lives, but somehow it didn't matter. In the stillness of that pond, something deeper was remembered in him too. Moral of the story: we often look to past or future lives, to other paths, other forms, hoping they will bring the peace we lack. But true wisdom isn't found in what we once were, it's in what we see now. When we stop chasing and begin to remember the stillness beneath the surface, we realize the life we seek is already here, waiting quietly in the present. The next story is called The Ant Who Recited the Lotus Sutra. In a quiet temple garden, under the shade of a plum tree, lived a colony of ants. Among them was one tiny ant with a strange habit. Every morning, just as the sun rose, it would stop on a smooth stone near the temple steps and raise its front legs gently toward the sky. It would stay there, unmoving, while the others scurried past, carrying food or building tunnels. The monks began to notice this tiny ritual. They called it the bowing ant. At first, they laughed softly at the sight. But one day, the abbot stopped during his morning walk, knelt down beside the stone, and simply watched. The ant stood still, legs raised, as if in prayer. A breeze passed, and the sun lit its tiny body. The abbot turned to his young disciple and said, "Do you know what it's doing?" The disciple smiled. "Maybe it's meditating." The abbot nodded. "Or perhaps it's reciting the Lotus Sutra." The boy laughed. "But master, it's just an ant. How can it know the Dharma?" The abbot looked back at the stone. "Then tell me, what is the Dharma?" The boy paused. "The teachings of the Buddha." The abbot smiled. "And what are those teachings but the practice of presence, compassion, and devotion?" "Look again." The boy crouched and watched in silence. The ant remained there, still as stone, touched by light and wind, its body small but unwavering. The abbot whispered, "It may not know the words, but it offers itself completely. That is enough." From then on, the boy watched the ant each morning. Slowly, he stopped laughing. He began to bow to it not because it was special, but because it reminded him of something real, that even the smallest being can teach the greatest truth if we are humble enough to see it. Moral of the story: wisdom doesn't always speak in words. Sometimes it walks with 6 legs, pauses in the morning light, and offers its whole being to the moment. True devotion is not found in how much we know, but in how deeply we offer ourselves fully, simply, and without needing to be seen. Even an ant, still and silent, may be chanting the Sutra of the Heart. The next story is called The Monk Who Watered Stones. In a dry and dusty part of the country, where the earth cracked and the rivers came only in spring, there was a small, forgotten temple. It had no gold statues, no long lines of visitors, just silence, wind, and one monk. His name was Yuto. Every day, just after sunrise, Yuto would carry 2 wooden buckets of water up the hill behind the temple. He would stop beneath a cluster of large, jagged stones, lifeless, grey and bare, and pour the water slowly over them. Not a single flower grew there. No tree took root, just stones. Villagers passing by would sometimes stop and watch him. One finally asked, "Why do you water rocks, old monk? They will never grow." Yuto smiled and said, "Perhaps not, but I still pour." Years went by. People came and went. The temple remained quiet. Yuto grew older, slower, his back bent from carrying those heavy buckets. Yet every day he climbed the hill and poured water on the stones without fail. One summer, a drought swept the land. Fields cracked, wells dried. People began to despair. But up on the hill, something strange happened. A single green shoot broke through the space between the stones. Then another, then a third. The rain had not returned, but deep beneath the surface, the stone had been holding the water, slowly soaking it into the earth. And now, life rose from that hidden store. The villagers were stunned. "How did this happen?" they asked. Yuto only bowed. "The stones are not what they seem." Later that day, a boy approached him and asked quietly, "Did you really believe the stones would bloom?" The old monk looked into the boy's eyes and said, "I didn't water the stones to make them change. I watered them so I would not forget how to give, even when nothing changed." He placed the bucket in the boy's hands and whispered, "Pour, even when the world is dry." Moral of the story: compassion is not always about results. Sometimes it's about presence, about choosing to show up again and again, even when nothing seems to grow. When we care without needing reward, we shape the world beneath the surface. And one day, without warning, the stone may bloom. The next story is called The Candle That Lit the Night Sky. In a remote village where the stars shone bright and the nights were long, a small temple stood at the edge of a field. In that temple lived a monk named Sayo, known for his quiet nature and deep love for the night. While others slept, Sayo would sit beneath the open sky, watching the moon, breathing with the rhythm of the wind. One night, a terrible storm swept through the village. Winds howled, trees bent low, and the power from the temple's lanterns and fires was lost. The temple hall fell into complete darkness. The young monks huddled together in fear, unable to see even their hands. Sayo said nothing. Instead, he walked silently to the altar, where a single beeswax candle remained, small, half-used, nearly forgotten. With great care, he lit it. The flame was gentle, barely a flicker, but in the vast darkness of the temple, it seemed to glow like a star. The young monks gathered around, grateful, but one asked, "Master, how can this little candle help us? The sky is dark, the storm is still strong. This can't change anything." Sayo smiled and said, "Perhaps not the sky, but it changes what we can see." He then carried the candle through the halls, one step at a time. As he walked, walls that were hidden began to show. The way forward became clear. The fear began to fade. He stopped at the center of the room and held the candle high. "This flame cannot stop the wind," he said. "It cannot dry the rain or hold back the night. But it lets us see one another. It gives us this moment." Later that night, the storm passed. The stars returned. But the monks remembered not the wind, nor the fear, but the single flame that had made them feel safe. Moral of the story: we often think great light is needed to change the world, but sometimes a small flame is enough to guide the heart. You don't need to shine like the sun. In someone's darkest hour, even a quiet kindness, a steady breath, or your simple presence can light the sky. The next story is called The Child Who Asked the Bodhidharma to Stay. Long ago, when the great Bodhidharma first crossed the sea to China, he came not to build temples or gain followers, but to sit quietly in the mountains and wait for nothing. With eyes like still water and silence as his only robe, he spent years in a cave facing a blank wall, unmoved by praise or rejection. Villagers nearby spoke of the strange foreign monk who never spoke, never begged, and never asked for anything. Some feared him, some mocked him, most simply left him alone. But not everyone. One morning, as fog curled through the trees, a small child named May wandered up the mountain alone. She had no robes, no scriptures, only curiosity. She stood at the edge of the cave, watching the old monk who did not move. After some time, she asked, "Are you a ghost?" Bodhidharma did not answer. She frowned. "Are you alive?" Still no reply. The silence didn't scare her. It made her wonder. She sat at the edge of the cave, hugging her knees, watching the monk watch the wall. Hours passed. The wind shifted. Clouds moved. He did not. The next day, she came again, then again. Each time she sat longer. She began to hum little songs. Sometimes she brought berries. Once, she brought her blanket and fell asleep beside him. One morning, as the first snowflakes fell, May arrived with tears in her eyes. "They say you will leave soon," she said softly. "Please don't. I don't know why, but when I sit here, everything feels quiet, even the loud things inside me." For the first time, Bodhidharma turned his head and looked at her. His face was calm, but there was warmth in his gaze. He reached into his robe and handed her a small, smooth stone from the cave floor. "You already carry the stillness," he said. "I was never the one giving it." Then, with no grand farewell, he stood and walked into the white trees. May stayed in the cave. She sat just as he had, with the stone in her palm and silence in her breath. She didn't try to become like him. She simply sat. And in time, the villagers noticed. The mountain still held peace, because the child had asked it to stay. Moral of the story: stillness does not belong to the wise or the old. It lives wherever we welcome it. When we sit with presence, without demand or noise, we carry the same silence as the masters. Sometimes, all it takes is the courage to ask it to stay and the heart to listen when it does. The next story is called The Teacup That Refused to Shatter. In a mountain temple where the fog kissed the rooftops each morning, there was a teacup passed down through generations. It was plain, no gold, no painting, no fine porcelain. But the monks treated it with care because it once belonged to a revered teacher who had spoken few words, yet left deep impressions on many hearts. The story was simple. This teacup had survived centuries of use, never cracking, never chipping. It had been dropped, mishandled, even left out in a storm, but it had never broken. Some believed it was blessed. Others said it was just luck. One day, a new monk named Jun was serving tea to the abbot. His hands trembled from nerves. As he reached to pour, he lost his grip. The legendary teacup slipped, fell to the stone floor and bounced, perfectly intact. Gasps echoed through the hall. Jun fell to his knees. "Master, I am so sorry. I dropped what should never be dropped." The abbot looked at the cup lying peacefully on its side and said, "Then maybe it wished to fall." Jun blinked, unsure. "But it didn't break." The abbot walked over, picked it up gently, and placed it back on the tray. Some things appear fragile but are not. Some carry a quiet strength built over time. This cup has been through centuries, not because it avoided being dropped, but because it knew how to fall. Jun lowered his head. "I feared I had ruined something sacred." The abbot touched his shoulder. "You revealed something sacred." That night, Jun sat alone in the kitchen, holding the cup. He turned it slowly in his hands, seeing it differently now, not as a perfect object, but as something that had endured, not because it resisted life, but because it accepted it, fully weathered by time, strengthened by use, softened by being held. Moral of the story: what looks delicate may carry the deepest strength. True resilience isn't found in never falling, it's in the grace to fall without shattering. In life, as in tea, we're not meant to be flawless, we're meant to be whole, even when shaken. Like a teacup that refuses to break, a quiet heart can endure what the world believes it cannot. The next story is called The Leaf That Didn't Fall. In the heart of an old monastery surrounded by maples and wind, autumn had come. Gold, amber, and red leaves danced through the air like soft fire, filling the temple grounds with beauty and change. Each day, monks swept the fallen leaves with quiet joy, knowing the falling was part of life just as breath leaves the body and moments pass through time. But one leaf remained. It clung to the highest branch of the tallest tree, just above the zendo roof. Days turned colder, winds grew stronger, rain came and went. Still, the leaf did not fall. It was small, green in the center, curled at the edges, trembling but refusing to let go. One morning, as monks gathered for sitting meditation, a young novice named Shin noticed the leaf and whispered to the abbot, "Master, all the other leaves have surrendered. Why does that one remain?" The abbot looked up and said gently, "Perhaps it has something left to learn." Shin stared at the leaf every day after that. He grew attached to it. He began to worry for it. What if it falls in the night and no one sees, he thought. What if it dies alone? One night, a storm rolled over the valley. The roof creaked and the trees bowed low. Shin woke before dawn and rushed outside barefoot, breath white in the air. The leaf was still there, but something inside him had changed. He didn't feel relief and stillness. He realized it wasn't the falling he feared. It was the letting go, not of the leaf but of needing it to stay. Later that day, the abbot called him to the garden. The leaf had finally fallen. It lay on the stone path, glistening with morning dew. Shin knelt beside it, heart open, and bowed. The abbot said quietly, "Even what stays will one day fall, and even what falls becomes part of the earth." Shin didn't weep. He simply picked up the leaf and carried it to the altar, not as something lost, but as something complete. Moral of the story: we hold tightly to moments, people, even pain, believing that holding on preserves meaning. But everything in life follows its rhythm. The leaf that didn't fall teaches us this: even delay is part of the dance. And when letting go finally comes, it is not the end, but a return to ground, to peace, to the ever-turning cycle of now. The next story is called The Hour That Lasted Forever. In a temple where time moved with the sound of water and wind, the monks lived by a strict schedule. Bells rang every hour, marking meditation, meals, chores, and rest. The days flowed like beads on a string, measured, balanced, and quiet. But one morning, just after the bell rang for the first sitting, something unusual happened. The next bell didn't come. Minutes passed. Then many more. The monks sat still, waiting for the familiar chime that would release them from their meditation. But it never came. They began to shift. Some peeked at the windows. Some grew anxious. One monk even coughed, thinking perhaps the bell ringer had fallen asleep. But the abbot remained still, eyes closed, body unmoving. An hour became 2. The silence stretched longer than any of them had ever sat before. Thoughts raced, legs ached. Some struggled to breathe calmly. Others grew angry in secret. When at last the abbot opened his eyes, the sun had already climbed high. He said gently, "You've just experienced the longest hour of your life. Tell me why." A young monk replied, "Because we didn't know when it would end." The abbot nodded. "Exactly. You waited for the bell instead of listening to the moment. You watched the door instead of watching your breath. You measured your peace by time instead of presence." He stood and walked slowly toward the window. What made the hour feel endless was not its length, it was your resistance to it. The moment you stopped trusting, time became a burden. He turned to them all and said, "But for me, that hour passed like a breath." The monks sat in silence, this time without waiting. The air felt lighter, not because the time had changed, but because they had. Moral of the story: time can stretch or shrink depending on how we meet it. When we wait for something to end, we leave the moment we're in. But when we trust the now without needing it to pass away, find that even the longest hour can hold stillness, clarity, and peace. It is not the clock that sets us free. It is presence. The next story is called The Mirror That Reflected Nothing. In a quiet hall deep within a mountain monastery, there hung an ancient mirror oval, worn and rimmed with darkened brass. It had no carvings, no shine, and to most eyes it seemed useless. Visitors would walk past it without pause. Monks never dusted it. The mirror appeared broken, for no image ever appeared in its glass. You could stand before it for hours and still see nothing, but still it remained. One day, a curious young monk named Cain asked the abbot, "Why do we keep this mirror? It doesn't reflect anything." The abbot smiled and replied, "That is precisely why it stays." Cain was puzzled. "But mirrors are meant to show things." The abbot nodded. "And what if what needs to be seen cannot be shown?" That night, Cain returned alone to the mirror. He stared into it, searching for his reflection. Nothing, no outline, no shadow, not even the glint of his eyes. Only a deep, quiet, darkness-like, still water with no surface. He felt unsettled. He began returning each evening, standing before the mirror in silence. He brought candles. He shifted angles. He tried blinking quickly, then not at all. Still nothing. Until one night, as the wind howled outside and the candles burned low, something within him stilled. He let go of trying to see anything. He simply stood, and in that moment, he felt something stranger, calm, wide space open inside him. Not because the mirror showed him who he was, but because it didn't. He realized he wasn't there to see a self, but to lose the idea of one. He knelt down before the dark glass and whispered, "Thank you." From then on, Cain sat before the mirror every morning in meditation, not to find his reflection, but to remember what lies beyond it. Moral of the story: we spend our lives looking into mirrors real and imagine searching for proof that we exist, that we matter, that we are someone. But the deepest clarity doesn't come from seeing ourselves. It comes from dissolving the need to. The mirror that reflects nothing reminds us. True peace arises not from finding an image, but from becoming the space where no image is needed. The next story is called When the Master Painted Air. In a mountain village where the mist never left the trees, there lived a Zen master named Kaku. He had once been a famous artist, known across the land for his delicate brushwork and breathtaking ink paintings of landscapes, birds, and waves. But after awakening, he stopped painting altogether. People still came to see him, bringing scrolls and asking for a single stroke of his brush. But Kaku always bowed gently and said, "I no longer paint what the eye sees." One day, a wealthy merchant traveled for days to find him. He brought silk, ink, and a fine brush made of wolf hair. Bowing deeply, he said, "Master, please, paint me something, anything. Your art is said to open the heart." Kaku nodded. He took the brush and held it in silence. The villagers gathered, waiting. He dipped the brush into the ink, then raised it high. His hand floated through the air, moving left, then right, then in slow circles. But he touched no paper. He made no mark. The merchant looked confused. "Master, you didn't paint anything." Kaku set the brush down. "I painted." "But where?" the man asked. "In the air," Kaku said calmly, "in silence, in the space before wanting something to appear." The merchant grew frustrated. "But I cannot take that with me. I cannot hang that on a wall." Kaku smiled. "Exactly. That is why it is real." The villagers stood quietly, some puzzled, Others moved without knowing why. Kaku looked at them all and spoke gently. The mind always wants to see results. A line, a picture, something finished. But what lives beneath the brush, the movement, the breath, the moment itself is the truest art. It disappears the moment it is made, yet it touches the place no ink ever could. He bowed to the space he had just brushed. Moral of the story: not all creation needs to be seen to be real. The deepest beauty lives not in what remains, but in what vanishes as soon as it appears. Like painting air, the present moment cannot be framed or kept, but it can be touched, felt, and known. And sometimes that is the most lasting art of all. The next story is called The Mountain That Wept for the Moon. There is a legend whispered among the oldest Zen Templesa story, not of monks or masters, but of a mountain. High above all paths and pilgrims, there stood a great mountain named Raku. For thousands of years, Raku held the sky in silence. Trees grew along its sides, snow softened its peak, and rivers were born from its frozen heart. But what no one knew was this: Raku loved the moon. Every night, when the world grew still and clouds drifted away, the moon would rise, and the mountain would gaze up in awe. The moon never stayed long. She floated gently, glowing above, and then disappeared beyond the horizon. But in those quiet hours, Raku felt complete. He never spoke, never moved. But every night, he waited. One season, the clouds came early. Night after night, the moon did not appear. Raku stood silent, but inside, something ached. Days passed, then weeks. The skies remained dark. The mountain grew colder, heavier, lonelier. And one night, something strange happened. A gentle rain began to fall, soft and silver, though no clouds could be seen. The monks who lived near the mountain woke and stepped outside, confused. The stars still shone. The sky was clear. But still, the rain fell quiet, slow, like tears, not from the heavens, but from the mountain itself. They said the mountain was weeping. When the clouds finally lifted weeks later and the moon returned, nothing was said. But those who lived nearby swore the snow on the peak shimmered that night, as if lit from within, as if the mountain smiled. A young monk asked his teacher, "Can a mountain really love the moon?" The teacher looked up at the glowing sky and replied, "Only something truly still can love without needing to be seen, and only something truly vast can break without making a sound." Moral of the story: sometimes love is not loud. Sometimes longing doesn't cry out. It waits quiet, unmoving, faithful in the dark. And when the heart breaks, it doesn't always shatter. It may simply let go, like a mountain releasing rain, not to beg for return, but to honor what was. In stillness we learn. Even what we cannot hold can move us forever. The next story is called The Voice That Came from the Ginkgo Tree. In the courtyard of a small temple stood a ginkgo tree, old and wide, its golden leaves fluttering like small suns each autumn. The monks often swept beneath it, sat under its shade, and watched its branches sway through the seasons. No one knew who planted it. It had always been therisolent, still, patient. A novice monk named Tetsu, young and full of restless energy, often sat near the tree during breaks from practice. He struggled with meditation, his thoughts loud and constant. He wanted answers, clear ones, fast ones. He longed to hear the Dharma spoken in thunder, in certainty. One evening, after failing again to still his mind, Tetsu sat beneath the ginkgo, feeling defeated. He whispered aloud, "Why is the mind so noisy? Why does the Buddha not speak to me like he spoke to the masters?" The courtyard was empty. The temple was silent. Only the tree stood near. Then, without warning, a breeze passed through the branches. A single leaf floated down and landed on his shoulder. In that moment, something opened. not with words, but with presence. He felt the softness of the air. He noticed the light fading behind the clouds. The sound of the leaves rustling became louder than the thoughts in his head. And for the first time, he did not think, he simply listened. Later, he told the head monk, "I think the tree spoke to me." The master smiled. "It has always been speaking." Tetsu blinked. "But I never heard it before." "That's because you were listening for a voice like yours," the master said. "But the Dharma does not always come in words. Sometimes it arrives in wind, sometimes in stillness, sometimes through a tree older than your questions." From that day on, Tetsu sat under the ginkgo tree not to escape his thoughts, but to meet them like leaves in the breeze, falling, floating, disappearing. He did not force his mind to be quiet. He simply listened. And the tree kept speaking. Moral of the story: wisdom does not always come as answers. Often it comes as presence. When we stop demanding sound and start receiving silence, the whole world begins to speak. And sometimes the voice of the Dharma is not loud or human, but soft as a falling leaf. The next story is called The Teacher Who Slept for 300 Years. In the hills above a forgotten village, there was a cave sealed by time and moss. The villagers rarely approached it, but the elders whispered of the one who slept inside, an ancient Zen teacher named Ishin, who, long ago, had entered deep meditation and never returned. Some said he was dead. Others believed he had simply paused. Legend claimed Ishin had once been a brilliant master, sharp-minded, fierce, and determined to understand every mystery of the Dharma. He read endlessly, debated endlessly, meditated through storms and fasted through winters. But one day, without warning, he stood before his students, smiled faintly, and said, "I'll go now, to rest my questions." He walked to the mountain, sat in the cave, closed his eyes, and didn't wake up. Years turned to decades. Generations passed, and still he slept. One quiet spring, exactly 300 years later, a young monk named Tetsu arrived in the village. He had heard stories of the sleeping teacher and felt drawn to the cave. With nothing but robes and a rice bowl, he climbed through brush and stone until he reached the opening. To his surprise, the moss had parted and the cave seemed to breathe. Inside, lit by a shaft of sunlight, sat Ishin cross-legged, hands folded, eyes closed. His body was untouched by time. Dust gathered on his robe, but he looked alive. Tetsu knelt in awe and waited. Then, slowly, Ishin's eyes opened. He looked around with a soft gaze, as if no time had passed. Tetsu bowed deeply and whispered, "Master, what did you find in your sleep?" Ishin looked at him, then at the light touching the cave wall, and said, "Nothing." Tetsu blinked. "Nothing?" Ishin nodded, smiling. "I chased the Dharma for years, thinking it was something to find. But in sleep, in stillness beyond effort, there was no more seeking. Just breath, just being. That was enough." He stood, stretched like wind moving through old trees, and walked toward the cave's mouth. Outside, the world had changed, but Ishin had returned with something eternal. Moral of the story: we chase wisdom through effort, through questions, through endless doing. But sometimes, awakening comes not from knowing more, but from stopping completely. When we sleep without fear, wait without needing, and rest without running, we discover the greatest teacher of all, stillness itself. The next story is called The Breath That Touched 1,000 Worlds. Long ago, in a forest temple wrapped in silence and moonlight, lived a hermit monk named Kaido. He was not known for teachings or sermons. He had no students, no shrine, no scriptures. He simply sat day after day, year after year under the same tree, breathing. Many believed he had lost his way. "He does nothing," they said. He says nothing. He teaches no one. What use is a monk who only breathes? One day, a curious traveler came seeking wisdom. She had read countless texts and visited many temples, but her heart remained unsettled. She had heard whispers of a monk in the forest who held no words but whose silence held something rare. When she arrived, Kaido did not greet her. He did not rise or speak. He simply sat in meditation, his breath deep, slow, steady. The traveler waited. She grew impatient. She coughed, rustled leaves, even stepped loudly on twigs. Still, he did not move. Frustrated, she finally asked aloud, "Is that all you do? Sit and breathe? How can that help anyone?" Kaido slowly opened his eyes and looked at her, not with judgment, but with a gaze so calm it felt like still water. He placed his hand over his heart and exhaled once. The breath was soft, but the world around them seemed to shift. The wind paused. The trees stilled. The space between them grew wider, quieter, deeper. Then he spoke, just one line. "This breath touches all beings." The traveler felt it not in her ears, but in her chest, as if something ancient inside her had heard something older than words. Her racing thoughts began to slow. Her hands, once tense, opened. Her eyes softened, and for the first time in years, she breathed without needing anything else. She sat down beside him. No more questions, just breath. Days later, she returned to her life. She never quoted a teaching. She simply listened more, rushed less, smiled more deeply. People noticed the difference and they, too, began to breathe a little softer. Moral of the story: sometimes the greatest teaching is not spoken or written, it is lived, breath by breath. A single breath, taken with awareness, can touch hearts, calm storms, and awaken what lies sleeping in others. In that one breath, you do not change the world, but you remember that you are already part of it. The next story is called "The Feather Left on the Zafu." In a quiet Zen temple near the edge of a forest, there was a zendo where monks sat for hours each day in silence. Cushions zafuswa arranged in perfect rows, the scent of incense always lingering in the air. One morning, after a long evening of sitting, the head monk entered the hall and noticed something unusual. On one of the cushions rested a single featherlight, white and perfectly still. He looked around. No windows were open. No birds had entered. Yet the feather remained, soft against the dark fabric of the zafu. He called for the monks and asked, "Whose cushion is this?" A young monk named Sora stepped forward, bowing low. "Mine, master." "Did you place this feather here?" Sora shook his head. "No, master. I found it this morning, just like you." The head monk nodded and said nothing more. But that day, he changed the morning lesson. He pointed to the feather and asked, "What does this teach?" One monk said, "It reminds us of impermanence, how even the smallest things can appear and vanish without warning." Another said, "It is a message from the winda, symbol of lightness, of letting go." A third whispered, "Maybe it's a gift from a bird that wished to meditate." The head monk listened to them all. Then he turned to Sora and asked, "And what did you feel when you saw it?" Sora paused. "I felt stillness, as if the cushion had held something sacred. It felt like the feather was the sitting itself, light, effortless, gentle." The master smiled. Yes, the cushion did not grab the feather, it simply received it. That night, Sora sat again. He didn't try to quiet his mind. He didn't force his breath. He just sat like a zafu, soft and open, letting thoughts land like feathers and drift away. He no longer struggled to hold stillness. He simply allowed it. From then on, monks began to speak quietly of the feather, teaching not as a lesson of words, but of presence. Moral of the story: awakening does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it lands quietly, like a feather on a cushion. It teaches not through effort, but through being, through the simple art of receiving each moment as it comes, weightless and complete. In that gentleness we remember, the mind does not have to grasp peace, it only needs to make space for it to land. The next story is called When a Question Became a Raindrop. In the hills of a quiet province, where clouds clung to the earth like forgotten dreams, a young monk named Ichi lived with a single burning question: what is the meaning of this life? He asked it while sweeping the floor, he asked it while meditating, he even asked it in his sleep. No matter what he did, the question followed him like a shadow. He read sutras, he listened to talks, he prayed under the stars, but no answer ever felt complete. His teacher, an old monk named Master Ray, would only smile when asked, saying, "Ask less, listen more." One summer afternoon, Ichi sat with his master on the steps of the temple as clouds gathered overhead. The air grew thick, and silence settled over the garden. Ichi's chest felt heavy. The question rose again like thunder in his ribs. He turned and whispered, "Master, please, what is the meaning of this life? Why are we here? What am I supposed to see?" Master Ray did not answer. He simply looked at the sky. Moments later, the first raindrop fell cool and sudden, landing gently on Ichi's hand. And in that moment, something happened. Not a thought, not a realization, just a feeling, complete, still, pure. The world didn't need to explain itself. The rain was not speaking in words, but it said everything. Ichi stared at the single drop on his skin, how it trembled, how it caught the light, how it slowly slid down without hesitation. No questions, no answers, just being. Master Ray looked at him and said, "When you asked from the mind, nothing came. But the rain answered your heart." Ichi blinked, eyes full, not from sorrow, but from stillness. The question did not disappear. It simply dissolved like a raindrop becoming the earth. From that day forward, he still had questions, but they no longer ruled him. He walked slower, breathed deeper. He let the world whisper back on its own terms. And when others came to him with searching eyes, he said gently, "Wait for the rain." Moral of the story: some questions are not meant to be answered with words. They are meant to lead you into silence, into the moment where the world speaks without sound. Like a raindrop on your hand, the answer may be small, passing, unnoticed. But if you are present, it will be enough. The next story is called The Door That Opened Inward. At the edge of a windswept cliff stood a small Zen hermitage, shaped like a teacup carved into stone. Few visited it, except those truly searching not for answers, but for something they couldn't name. The hermit who lived there, an old woman named Ayu, rarely spoke. Yet stories whispered of a strange wooden door at the front of her huta door that didn't open out like most, but inward. Pilgrims who came to her often paused at that door, uncertain. It looked like it led into the earth itself, weathered, silent and firm. It bore no handle. Some knocked, some called. Many left. One day, a young man named Jiro arrived, worn from the world, carrying books, beliefs, and questions. He had studied in temples, argued with scholars, meditated in caves. Yet peace had slipped through his fingers, always just beyond reach. When he came to the door, he knocked. There was no reply. He waited, then pushed gently. It didn't move. He pushed harder. Still nothing. Frustrated, he sat down outside. How can one enter a place with a door that won't open? As the sun fell and silence grew thick, Ayu finally stepped from the back of the hut. She smiled, her robe fluttering in the wind. "You are not the first to struggle," she said. Jiro stood quickly and bowed. "Master, I've come for teaching, but this door it refuses to open." Ayu nodded. "Yes, because you keep trying to push." Jiro blinked. "Then what must I do?" She stepped forward and whispered, "Pull." He hesitated, then gently reached forward and pulled the door toward himself. It opened easily, effortlessly. He stared at it in awe. Ayu said, "The door to truth never opens outward. It does not yield to force or demand. It waits to be opened inward, just like the heart, just like the self." Inside, there was no shrine, no books, just an empty room with a single cushion and a window facing the sky. Jiro smiled, and for the first time in years, he stepped through a door without needing to arrive anywhere. Moral of the story: we often push through life, hoping peace will be found beyond the next answer, next step, next door. But truth does not yield to pressure. The deepest openings happen not by force, but by softening. The doors that matter most open inwardly when we are ready to let ourselves in. The next story is called The Drumbeat from the Void. In a remote temple built into the side of a wind-carved cliff, there was an ancient drum no one dared to play. It hung in the center of the meditation hall, wrapped in deep red cloth, untouched for generations. The elders said it had been used only once long ago by a master who struck it during a moment of great insight. Since then, no sound had come from it. Young monks often asked about it, curious. "Why does no one play the drum?" "Because it was not made for sound," the abbot would reply, "but for silence." This answer only deepened the mystery. One night, a restless monk named Jiro couldn't sleep. His heart was full of noise. Doubts, regrets, ambitions all circling like birds in a storm. He wandered into the meditation hall, drawn to the silent drum. The moonlight shone through the windows, touching its surface gently, like fingers on skin. Jiro sat before it and whispered, "If I cannot quiet my mind, then let the void answer me." He raised his hand and struck the drum once softly. It made no sound, but the moment the cloth-covered wood met his palm, something deep shifted inside him. The noise in his mind fell silent, not from force, but from falling away. His thoughts scattered like leaves, and in their place rose a single awareness, emptiness that was full. He sat there for hours, not knowing if he had heard anything with his ears, but feeling clearly that something had spoken to him, not in words, not in rhythm, but in stillness so deep it echoed through his bones. The next morning, the abbot found him still sitting. "You struck the drum," he said. Jiro looked up, eyes wide with wonder. "I think it struck me." The abbot smiled. "That is the true sound." Moral of the story: not all drums are made to be heard. Some are struck to remind us that silence, too, has weight. When the mind becomes still enough, even emptiness carries a rhythm. And in that rhythm, without echo, without noise, we may hear the deepest sound of all, the one that needs nothing, the one that has always been beating within. The next story is called The Path That Grew from Stillness. There was once a monk named Ryan who lived at the edge of a great forest, in a small hut with no road leading to it. When asked why he lived in such isolation, he would simply smile and say, "I do not move toward the path. I wait for the path to move toward me." He spent his days in silences, weeping his hut, tending a small garden, and sitting beneath the trees. He never sought to teach, but slowly, without invitation, people began to come. One at a time, then more. Lost wanderers, tired travelers, those with heavy hearts. They arrived with questions about suffering, purpose, enlightenment. Ryan never offered answers. He simply poured tea, listened, and returned to stillness. Over time, something remarkable happened. A path began to form, faint at first, then visible. Not paved, not planned, just worn earth, shaped by the quiet footsteps of those who had come to sit, breathe, and then walk away lighter. What once was dense forest now bore a gentle trail, carved not by design, but by presence. One day, a scholar from the city visited. He carried books and many words. He sat before Rian and asked, "Master, how did you know the path would appear?" Rian looked at the man with kind eyes and said, "I didn't." "Then why did you wait here?" Rian looked up at the canopy of leaves, sunlight moving through them like water. "Because I knew stillness would call those who needed it, not through noise, but through gravity." The scholar was silent. Rian added, "A river does not chase the thirsty. The moon does not follow the lost. They simply shine, and because they do, others find their way." The scholar stayed for 3 days. He asked no more questions. When he left, he stepped quietly onto the same soft trail, becoming part of its unfolding. Years later, the path was wide, yet no one ever claimed it. It simply continued to grow from stillness. Moral of the story: we chase purpose and direction, believing we must forge a path to matter. But sometimes the greatest journey begins by standing still. Stillness is not emptiness, it is invitation. When we stop striving to be found, we become the place others find. The true path often grows not from effort, but from presence. The next story is called "The Pebble That Said Moo." On the path leading to a quiet mountain temple, there was a small pile of pebbles gathered over many years. Pilgrims walking the trail would often pick one up and carry it with them, then place it back in the pile when they left, an unspoken tradition no one could fully explain. The monks simply said, "Each stone listens." A young novice named Riku was troubled by one koan above all others, the one word that echoed through centuries of Zen. Mu. He had heard it many times. A monk asked, "Does a dog have Buddha nature?" The master replied, "Mu." Riku studied the word obsessively. What did it mean? Yes? No? Emptiness? Refusal? Freedom? One afternoon, frustrated and tired, he walked the temple path alone. He kicked at the stones until one caught his eye, a small, smooth pebble, perfectly round. For reasons he couldn't explain, he picked it up and held it in his hand. "What is Mu?" he whispered to the stone. Of course, it did not answer. But something strange happened. Holding the pebble, he stopped thinking. He stopped forcing. He simply stood still, just the weight of the stone in his palm, the feel of it against his skin, the warmth of the sun above, the sound of wind threading through trees. And in that stillness, his question no longer needed an answer. The word Mu wasn't something to solve, it was something to return to. Like breath, like silence, like this tiny stone complete in itself. He laughed softly, tears welling without sadness. He kissed the pebble gently and placed it back on the pile. That evening, when asked by his teacher if he had made progress on the koan, Riku bowed and replied, "A pebble taught me today." The master smiled and said, "Then listen to everything." Moral of the story: some questions are not answered with words, but with presence. Mu does not speak to the mind, it breaks it open. When we stop trying to understand with thought and start meeting the moment as it is, even a pebble can become a teacher. And in that one small stone, the whole universe quietly says, Mu. The next story is called "The Cloud That Waited for a Student." In a remote monastery hidden in the highlands, where the sky stretched wide and the wind spoke like breath, there lived a gentle master named Shoen. He was known for his quiet ways, never rushing, never raising his voice. When asked why he never gave direct teachings, he would smile and say, "Some lessons arrive like clouds. You don't chase them, you wait beneath them." One day, a young student named Emmy arrived, full of questions and fire. She had left behind everything: home, family, a life filled with noise to seek truth. She begged Master Shoen for teachings, for answers, for the real path. But the master said only, "Go sit by the cliff, watch the sky, come back when something speaks." Emmy felt confused, even insulted. "I didn't come all this way to look at clouds," she thought. But she obeyed. Each day she sat. And each day the sky offered nothing but silence. Clouds came and went. The wind changed. The light shifted. But no wisdom revealed itself. Days turned into weeks. Her questions grew quieter, her heart more tired. Then one morning she sat as usual, her back to the rising sun, and there it was, a single heavy cloud floating alone across the sky. It didn't pass like the others. It hovered. Time slowed. The cloud moved gently, as if bowing to her stillness. In that moment, Amy felt something open, not in the sky, but in herself. She wasn't thinking. She wasn't waiting. She was simply here. And the cloud, like an old teacher, lingered for just a breath, longer, then moved on. Emmy bowed. When she returned to Shuen, he said nothing. He poured tea, handed her a cup, and smiled. "It waited for you," he said. She nodded, "And I almost missed it." He looked up at the sky and replied, "Clouds don't wait forever, but sometimes, if you're still enough, one will pause just long enough for you to remember. The sky has always been teaching." Moral of the story: wisdom doesn't always arrive with thunder or voice. Sometimes it floats in gently, waiting only for stillness to be seen. The deepest lessons are not taught, they are noticed. And often, the moment we stop seeking is when the cloud arrives. The next story is called "The Candle Lit by No Flame." In a dim meditation hall far from the village roads, there was a single candle placed on a low wooden altar. It had never been lit. Its wick was clean and untouched, and yet the monks bowed before it every morning. There was no story carved into the altar, no name given to the candle. But all who came to the temple seemed to sense something in its quiet presence, something they couldn't explain. A novice named Kenji once asked the abbot, "Why do we bow to a candle that gives no light?" The abbot replied, "Who said it gives no light?" Kenji blinked, confused. "But master, it has never been lit." The abbot smiled gently. "Not all light is seen with the eyes." Kenji sat with this for days, watching the candle in silence. He tried to imagine what it would look like burning. He imagined its glow, its warmth. Still, the wick remained untouched, and his thoughts only made him more distant. One evening, during a storm, the temple lost all light. The wind howled through the walls, and the lamps were snuffed out. The hall was dark, utterly dark. The monks sat anyway, breathing together in silence. Kenji sat in front of the candle, unable to see it, only feel its shape in memory. And for the first time, he let go of the need to see anything at all. No more imagining, no more questions. Just breath, darkness, and presence. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. He felt a soft brightness, not in the room, but within. Not heat, but stillness. Not sight, but understanding. The candle hadn't changed. He had. When the storm passed and the lamps were relit, Kenji looked at the candle and bowed, not because it gave light, but because it reminded him where true light lives. The next morning, he asked the abbot, "Master, was it ever meant to be lit?" The abbot shook his head. "It already is." Moral of the story: true illumination does not come from flame or form. It comes from within, when the mind grows still and the heart opens. Some candles do not burn, yet they show us the path. Because the deepest light cannot be seen, it is felt in the dark, where nothing is visible but everything is known. The next story is called "The Monk Who Became a Bird in Meditation." There was once a monk named Senyo, who lived in a quiet temple beside a lake where the mountains touched the sky. He was known for his deep, unwavering meditation. Hours would pass, sometimes whole days, with Senyo sitting motionless beneath the temple's great cedar tree. Even the birds landed near him without fear, as if they too recognized the stillness he carried. But Senyo carried a secret longing, one he never spoke aloud, to be free not from suffering, not from the world, but from form itself. "I want to know what it means to be without boundary," he once wrote in a journal no one ever read. "To fly, not with wings, but with no need for ground." One morning, as fog lay thick over the lake, Senyo entered meditation with a feeling unlike before. His breath grew thin, his body light. Time slowed until it vanished completely. Then even he would not say how it happened. He was no longer sitting. He was soaring. Above the trees, over the lake, through the wind, he moved not with thought, but with joy. His form was not solid. He was not man, or monk, or memory. He was wing and breeze, sky and space. A bird, yes, but also more than a bird. Free not just in flight, but in self. From the temple grounds, other monks looked up in wonder as a single bird circled once above the cedar, tree graceful, silent, present. They did not know where Senyo had gone. They waited for hours, then days. When he finally opened his eyes, Senyo said nothing. He rose slowly, bowed to the tree, and walked to the edge of the lake. He no longer sought to leave the body. He no longer wished to fly. The flight had taught him what the earth never could, that freedom isn't escape, it's presence, without borders. From that day on, Senyo smiled more. He no longer meditated to go somewhere. He meditated to be where he was entirely. Moral of the story: we long for escape, for freedom beyond the body, beyond the self. But true flight is not found by leaving it, is found by dissolving. When we drop all boundaries, even for a breath, we become not something else but everything. In stillness, the soul remembers. You were never just sitting, you were already flying. The next story is called The Shoeless Pilgrim's Awakening. In a distant province where the mountains kissed the sky, there walked a pilgrim with no shoes. His name was Koma, and he had set out alone to find a great teacher said to live beyond the ridges of the eastern peaks. He carried no food, no scrolls, no companions, only a walking stick and a bowl tied to his belt. His feet bled as he walked over gravel and stone. Still, he kept moving, whispering prayers with each step. "Please," he would say, "let me find the one who will awaken me." One morning, after weeks of travel and hunger, Koma reached a quiet hill. At its top stood a small hut made of wood and earth. Smoke rose from the chimney. A figure sat outside, peeling fruit. Koma dropped to his knees and cried, "Are you the one? Are you the teacher I've been searching for?" The old man looked up calm, barefoot, smiling. "That depends," he said. "On what?" Koma asked, desperate. The man motioned to the pilgrim's feet. "On whether you believe awakening lies farther than you've already walked." Koma blinked, confused. "I've walked miles. I've crossed rivers. I've suffered. And in all that walking," the old man asked gently, "were you awake?" Koma fell silent. The man continued, "Each stone you stepped on, each drop of rain, each breath, they all called to you. Did you hear them, or were you only listening for a voice at the end?" Tears welled in Koma's eyes. He looked down at his broken feet, the dried blood, the dust. "I was chasing something," he whispered, "and I missed everything." The teacher nodded. "That is why your feet are bare, so you could feel the world as it is, not as a lesson, but as a path." Koma sat down beside him. No more searching, just sitting, breathing, feeling the earth beneath him. The teacher handed him a piece of fruit. "Eat," he said, "the road has already spoken." Moral of the story: we walk long paths seeking what's already within. Awakening isn't found at the end of a journey, it's in each barefoot step, each moment we didn't rush past. When we stop running and truly feel the ground beneath us, even pain can become a teacher, and sometimes the greatest wisdom comes not from finding, but from finally stopping. The next story is called The Master's Final Cough. Master Keen was known for his quiet teachings and deep presence. He never gave long talks, never sought followers, and rarely answered questions with more than a word. Yet his silence carried more weight than books, and his gaze made even the most restless student still. For many years, he taught in a simple temple surrounded by wind-brushed pines. The students came and went, some staying for days, others for decades. All of them waited for the moment they believed would come the day Master Keen would reveal the ultimate truth, the final teaching, the secret hidden behind all words. That moment came, though not as they expected. One winter morning, as snow gathered gently on the stone steps, Master Keen grew ill. He stopped eating, he stopped walking, but he did not stop smiling. His students sat beside him, quietly watching, their hearts full of questions. They leaned in, waiting for last words, a final insight, a perfect farewell. The old master lay still, his breath thin, his eyes soft. Then suddenly he coughed, just once. A sharp, dry, unremarkable sound. Then silence. His breath did not return. The students sat frozen. One wept, another whispered, "That can't be it." A third asked, "Was the cough the final teaching?" The oldest monk among them stood and said gently, "Yes." The others stared at him in confusion. He bowed toward the body and said, "We waited for something profound, but truth does not wait for the perfect sentence. It arrives exactly as it is. The Master gave us a cough not to confuse us, but to wake us." He looked around the room. He coughed, and then he let go. No drama, no conclusion, just this moment, then no moment. Slowly, the students began to understand. The cough was not a message, it was a mirror. Ordinary, fleeting, real. Like life itself. They bowed as one. Not to the body, but to the silence that followed it. Moral of the story. We often wait for wisdom to come wrapped in beauty, in ceremony, in words that shine. But the deepest truths arrive as life does, in a breath, in a sound, in something we almost miss. The Master's final cough reminds us, awakening does not need to impress. It only needs to be met fully, simply, now. The next story is called The Gatha Written in Wind. In a small temple by the sea, there lived a monk named Seiji who had never written a single word. While other monks copied sutras with elegant calligraphy or composed Gathas poems of realization, Seiji remained silent. He swept the garden, lit incense, watched waves roll in and out. His presence was quiet, unnoticed by most. Some of the younger monks whispered that Seiji was slow or perhaps dull. "He never writes," they said. "He has no verses of his own." One day, a visiting teacher came to the temple. The monks proudly shared their Gathas written in gold ink on silk scrolls. Each line was poetic, filled with phrases about emptiness, awakening, and stillness. When it was Seiji's turn, he simply bowed and said, "I have no Gatha to offer." The teacher looked at him kindly. "Then where is your understanding written?" Seiji turned and pointed outside, to the sand garden he had raked that morning. The wind had since swept through it, leaving swirling patterns in the dust. The sea breeze moved gently through the pines, shaking loose a few golden needles. "There," Seiji said, "it was written, but now it's gone." The other monks looked confused. The teacher simply smiled. "Ah," he whispered, "a Gatha written in wind." That evening, the teacher spoke to all the monks. Words can capture truth, but only for a moment. Seiji wrote his Gatha with breath, with movement, with silence, and then let it go. That, too, is wisdom. Seiji sat in the back, not proud, not ashamed, just still like the wind after it passes. From then on, whenever monks grew obsessed with finding perfect words, the abbot would gently remind them, "Do not forget the gather that left no trace." Moral of the story: not all teachings are meant to be recorded. Some are written in sand, in wind, in passing moments. The truest expressions often leave nothing behind because they were lived, not preserved. Like a breath or a breeze, their power lies not in their permanence, but in their presence. When we let go of needing our wisdom to last, it begins to speak more clearly than ever. The next story is called The Enlightenment Under the Broken Roof. In a remote corner of the countryside stood a crumbling temple, long forgotten by pilgrims and kings. Its roof sagged in the middle, the walls leaned with age, and the floor creaked with every step. Most believed it was abandoned, but inside, beneath the broken beams and falling dust, lived a monk named Daiju. Daiju had once trained in great cities, in spotless temples lined with scrolls and golden altars. But something about the silence of this ruined place had called to him. "It is falling apart," the villagers had warned. "Why would you stay?" Daiju only smiled and said, "Things that break often teach better than things that shine." Each day he swept the cracked floors, boiled rice over an old fire, and meditated as raindrops fell through holes in the roof. He patched what he could, but never tried to restore the temple to perfection. "Let it be honest," he once said. "Let it show its years." One night, during heavy rain, Daiju sat in meditation as water dripped steadily onto the floor. Then a sudden crack. Part of the roof collapsed, sending broken wood crashing just behind him. Dust filled the air. Wind poured in. Daiju didn't move. When the storm passed, a traveler who had taken shelter nearby ran into the room, shouting, "You could have died. Why didn't you run?" Daiju opened his eyes, calm and clear, and said, "Because in that moment, there was nowhere else but here." The traveler stared, soaked and shivering. Daiju gestured toward the open roof. "For years, I tried to find enlightenment through silence, through study, through effort. But it came in the sound of breaking wood. In the crash I did not resist. When the roof broke, so did the illusion of control. What remained was only this breath, this ground, this now." He looked up at the night sky through the open ceiling and smiled. "The roof broke, but I woke up." Moral of the story: we seek awakening in stillness, in beauty, in peace. But sometimes it comes through the sharp sound of what we cannot control. When something breaks and we do not run, we see that the sky was always there above us. Enlightenment doesn't arrive through perfection. It comes through presence, even under a broken roof. The next story is called The Laughing Spider in the Sutra Room. In a hidden wing of an old mountain temple, where scrolls of ancient sutras lined the walls and dust floated like whispers, a spider had made its home. It lived quietly in the corner, its web stretched between two forgotten shelves of sacred texts. No one noticed it except for one young monk named Haku. He had been assigned to clean the sutra room each morning. Every day he would sweep around the spider's web, careful not to disturb it. The spider never moved much. It simply sat, still as a stone, watching the world with its many eyes. Haku found comfort in its silence. He began to talk to it softly during his chores, sharing his thoughts, doubts, and dreams. "I study all day," he once whispered. "I chant, I memorize, I bow. But still, I don't feel awake." The spider, of course, said nothing. But one morning, Haku entered the room and found the web sparkling with morning light. Dew had gathered across its threads, making it shimmer like something sacred. The spider sat in the center, motionless. Then, without warning, it moved so fast, so effortlessly, that it startled him. It danced across the strands, then paused, then moved again in what seemed like a spiral. Haku laughed out loud. not because it was funny, but because in that moment the spider seemed to be joyful. It moved not with hunger or fear but with freedom. That night, Haku asked the abbot, "Can a spider be enlightened?" The abbot looked up from his tea. "That depends," he said. "Are you willing to be taught by one?" Haku lowered his head. "I think it showed me something." The abbot smiled. "Then perhaps the spider was laughing at all the words you cling to and dancing through the silence you've been avoiding." From that day forward, Haku no longer searched the sutras for the perfect line. He read them with gratitude, but bowed each morning not to the scrolls but to the small web in the corner, where presence lived without effort. Moral of the story: awakening isn't always found in the sacred words, but sometimes in the silent things that live beside them. A spider weaves its truth without needing language, and its stillness can teach more than 1,000 chants. When we open our eyes to life's smallest moments, even a web becomes a mirror. And sometimes, in that reflection, the universe quietly laughs. The next story is called The Bowl That Caught the Sun. At the top of a lonely ridge where few dared to live, there was a weathered hut with a single window facing east. Inside lived an old nun named Koan, known for saying little and laughing often. She owned almost nothing: no scrolls, no beads, no fine robes. Only a wooden bowl, worn smooth from years of use, which she kept beside her mat like a quiet companion. Each morning before sunrise, she would carry the bowl outside and place it on the flat stone just beyond the hut. Then she would sit beside it in silence, hands folded, waiting for the first light to rise over the edge of the world. To passing travelers, the scene looked strange. One finally asked, "Revered one, why do you offer your bowl to the sun? It cannot eat." Koan smiled. "It's not the sun I'm offering to, it's the bowl I'm feeding." The traveler looked confused, but she said no more. Seasons passed. The old nun's hair turned silver, her body slower. But still, every day, she brought out the bowl, placed it on the stone, and waited. One morning, a young monk climbed the ridge. He had heard stories of her and wanted to learn. He arrived before dawn, bowed, and asked, "Please, may I sit with you?" She nodded, and together they sat in silence. As the sky turned soft with light, the sun broke over the mountain, casting golden rays. The bowl, resting quietly on the stone, lit up with fire glowing, holding light as if it had been waiting all night to receive it. The monk stared in awe. Koan leaned in and whispered, "The bowl cannot grasp. It only receives." The monk turned to her, eyes wide. She added, "We spend our lives chasing the sun, trying to hold it, name it, earn it. But if you sit quietly, it will come, and you will see you were always the bowl." She lifted the bowl gently, warm from the light, and brought it to her heart. Moral of the story: peace is not something we chase, it's something we make space for. Like a bowl, we must be empty to be filled. When we stop grasping and simply sit with stillness, the light will arrive on its own. The sun never forgets to rise. We only forget how to receive it. The next story is called The Flame That Burned Up Time. In a temple deep within the desert, where sand whispered across stone and time itself seemed to slow, there was a ritual held only once a year. On the longest night, the monks would gather in silence, each carrying a small candle. They would walk barefoot to the center of the courtyard, light their flames from a single torch, and sit until dawn, watching the fire flicker through the dark. One year, a new monk named Riku arrived just before the ceremony. He was young, eager, and burdened with questions. His thoughts were always racing about the past he couldn't fix and the future he hadn't yet reached. He hoped the ritual would quiet his mind, or at least give him answers. As the flame touched his candle, he whispered, "Let this burn away what binds me. The monks sat still. The wind curled low across the courtyard, but the flames danced calmly, each one a mirror of breath. Riku stared at his flame, watching how it moved without needing to move anywhere. It reached upward but never rushed. It flickered but never feared its fading. Slowly, something softened in him. Time began to slip away. The hours passed without notice. The night grew deeper. The stars turned overhead. At some point, Riku could no longer tell if he was watching the flame or if the flame was watching him. He no longer thought about what had happened yesterday. He no longer wondered about what might come tomorrow. His breath and the flame had become one rhythm, steady, quiet, alive. When the first light of dawn touched the sky, a bell rang. The monks stood. The flames were gently blown out. Riku looked down at the tiny smoke rising from his candle and felt something unfamiliar. Not joy, not sorrow, just presence, pure and whole. He turned to the abbot and said softly, "The night felt like a single breath." The abbot nodded. "When you truly watch the flame, it burns more than wax. It burns away the illusion of time." Moral of the story: we are often caught in the past or lost in the future, believing time is something to chase or outrun. But true peace lives where time dissolves in the still flicker of now. The flame that does not hurry, that simply glows, teaches us this: the present moment is eternal when we are fully inside it. Let it burn, let it clear, and you will find yourself beyond time. In these 3 quiet hours, we journeyed through mist-covered mountains, broken roofs, silent bodhisattvas, and the soft landing of a feather on a cushion. We met monks who turned into birds, leaves that refused to fall, and clouds that waited not to be chased, but to be seen. Each story, whether whispered through the rustle of bamboo or carried on the wing of a passing thought, pointed to the same truth. The present moment is enough, not when it's perfect, not when it's quiet, but when it is met fully with open hands and an unguarded heart. So now, as this session ends, you don't need to remember every story. You only need to remember to stop, breathe, and return. Because the teachings live not in the words, but in the space you give them. If one story stirred something in you, peace, reflection, or even a question, leave a comment below. Let this be your footprint on the path for someone else to follow. And if you'd like more gentle teachings, quiet awakenings, and mindful moments like these, subscribe to the channel. Let's keep walking together, one breath at a time. The bell has rung. The moment is now. You are home.